It was an Amish community defined by peace and seclusion.
Amish country was just calm and quiet and away from the rat race of the city.
But their isolated world is turned upside down by a horrific crime.
There was blood on her nightgown. There was some type of gunshot wound.
As police begin to look deeper within the community, troubling secrets come to light.
Classified himself as the Amish stud in his online profile.
You're not supposed to have a cell phone, much less be, in a sex chat room.
Had someone targeted an Amish family for revenge?
There was a phone call that just said basically, you can run but you can't hide.
Or had a forbidden romance triggered a cold-blooded conspiracy?
There was over 800 searches made on that computer about how to poison a human being.
They seemed to have a real attraction to things that were forbidden just for the very sake that they were forbidden.
You realize that people do wear masks. They hide who they truly are.
Wayne County, Ohio is only 60 miles south of Cleveland, but it's a world away from modern city life. Wayne County is also home to the largest number of Amish in America.
The Amish say it's America that changed, not the Amish, that they've been living this way for hundreds of years.
Their communities are very self-contained. They have certain rules they have to follow. They're not allowed to have cars, but they are allowed to hire a driver. They're not allowed to own a telephone, but they can use someone else's. They're not allowed to have electric or gas refrigerators, but they have ice in ice boxes.
One of the devoted members of Wayne County's Amish community was Barbara Miller. Born in 1979, Barbara came from a large, tight-knit Amish family.
Barbara grew up in the Andy Weaver sect of the Amish community in America.
They hold to the stricter tenets of the faith. They don't succumb to the temptations of the world, since the world is a world of sin as they view it.
From a young age, Barbara embraced her Amish roots.
During Rumspringa, which is the teenage years in the Amish faith, teenagers can experiment. They might go to a concert if they've never been to a concert. They could go to a party. They could, drink alcohol. They're facing the question of, are they going to be baptized and live forever as Amish or not?
Occasionally, you'll get the Amish kids that don't come back. They choose to drop the Amish faith.
Barbara was, totally different. She read Amish romance stories and had sleepovers and, giggled with her friends.
She was a very quiet, soft-spoken kind of person.
She was very pretty and just very sweet, and everybody loved her. Her dreams as a teenager were to grow up and be a wife and mother.
When she was 18, Barbara caught the attention of another Amish teenager named Eli Weaver.
Their families would have known each other from the close-knit Andy Weaver community in that area of Ohio. Eli had always had this charisma that was kind of tantalizing to her.
With their parents' blessing, Eli and Barbara got married on May 27, 1999. The couple wasted no time starting a family.
They had 5 children in the first 7 years of marriage.
There were 3 boys and 2 girls, and the children went to a local Amish school.
To provide for his family, Eli ran a small business next to their home.
It was a sporting goods shop. Sold firearms, equipment for deer hunting, fishing. It was just like a mom and pop shop.
While Eli worked, Barbara stayed home with the children.
What was important to Barbara was her church, her faith, her community, her children, her home.
Amish women are generally busy with sewing clothes for the family. Or oftentimes when I came, I would see her outside mowing the lawn, and she's planting a garden, and she's cleaning the house, and they do a lot of things by hand, the old-fashioned way, and it's just really a lot more work involved. When she interacted with her children, she would just quietly tell them not to do something again if they did something they shouldn't, and I could see that they really loved her.
But on Tuesday, June 2nd, 2009, both the Weaver household and the Wayne County Amish community are shaken to their core when an emergency call comes into the sheriff's office.
911, do you have an emergency?
Yes, we do. Person not responding.
At what address?
The Amish don't have telephones, but what they do have is they have a community phone in a shack that they maintain, and the families all share it, obviously for emergencies, and this was an emergency.
The caller says the victim is her next-door neighbor, Barbara Weaver. She tells dispatchers that one of Barbara's children found her unconscious in her bed.
The neighbor then came to the house and tried to wake Barbara, and seeing blood on her chest, who then ran to the phone booth.
You know if the person's breathing?
No, I don't think she's breathing.
Within minutes, emergency responders arrive.
We were met outside by the neighbor lady who had actually called 911 and pointed us in the general direction. We entered and went to the bedroom where we found the lady in her bed there.
EMS checked for a pulse. There was no pulse, and she was declared dead on scene.
There was blood on her nightgown. So we pulled the nightgown back, and that's when we noticed what appeared to be some type of gunshot wound.
They could see that she was shot in the right side of the chest.
Investigators from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office arrive at the Weaver home and quickly begin analyzing the crime scene.
There was powder burn on the blankets that were covering Barbara, which indicated that the muzzle blast must have been very close proximity to the blankets when the gun was fired.
It's a close-range shot. It's very tough to be accidental in a situation like that.
It looked like a shotgun wound because of the size of the hole.
There was no weapon found at the scene. If she had shot herself, the weapon would have been there at the scene, and it was not. Detectives did do a gunshot residue test on Barbara Weaver's hand. They came back negative.
Detectives rule Barbara's death a homicide. Determining a motive, however, is more complicated.
There was no signs of forced entry into the residence. There was cash laying in the basement on the counter. And there was also cash laying upstairs on the kitchen counter that had not been tampered with.
There was nothing taken at all.
So burglary/robbery is not really a motive in my way of thinking at that point in the investigation.
As a CSI unit continues to process the home, detectives head outside to speak to the family's neighbors.
The police wanted to know, of course, where the spouse was. Where's the husband of this woman who's been shot?
Police had learned that Barbara's husband, Eli, ran a store right across the street, but that store was closed and no one had seen Eli all morning. Then that left them wondering if he knew something about the murder or maybe if he was a victim himself.
Coming up, as police search for Eli Weaver, a witness comes forward with startling allegations.
She was afraid that somebody would be so jealous that they would harm Barbara.
And an ominous clue suggests the family might have been targeted for retribution.
This message that was on this phone was, you can run, but you can't hide.
The Amish community of Wayne County, Ohio, has been turned upside down after wife and mother Barbara Weaver is found shot to death in her home.
Word was spreading fast among the neighbors that somebody had killed Barbara Weaver. It was very emotional, very chaotic, very sad.
It's a very quiet community where this took place. Not a lot of crime at all.
You don't hear about this happening, especially an Amish woman getting killed. It just doesn't happen. It was news immediately in the area. It became statewide and I believe national news almost instantly.
You just don't know what to think. You don't know if it was just someone coming through the area or someone in the area.
Missing from the scene is Barbara's husband, Eli Weaver.
Anytime there's a murder, unfortunately, you have to also look at family members as suspects, and you have to eliminate them as suspects. And we needed to talk to Eli.
In speaking with friends of the family, investigators gather new information about his whereabouts.
He had left early that morning, according to the witnesses, around 3 a.m. to go on a fishing trip, which is not unusual for Eli. Eli does a lot of fishing.
He said he was at Lake Erie fishing with some friends, which is about an hour and 20 minutes away from his home.
One of the men wasn't Amish in the group and actually had a cell phone, so the neighbor was able to call him and let him know there was a tragic incident involving Eli's wife and that Eli needed to come home right away.
Eli was contacted by phone and agreed to meet with detectives at the Wayne County Sheriff's Office.
4 hours later, Eli finally returns to town from his fishing trip and meets with detectives at the Wayne County Sheriff's Office.
They explained to him his wife had been found dead and had been shot. Eli Weaver was a distraught husband who had no explanation why somebody would want to kill his wife.
Detectives ask Eli to retrace the past 24 hours.
Eli stated that he had come home late the night before, or I believe it was around 11 p.m. from another fishing trip, went into the house.
According to Eli, he saw his oldest son asleep on the recliner as he walked through the living room.
He then went to bed himself and actually overslept the next morning.
Eli tells detectives that Barbara had woken up to tell him goodbye when he left at 3 a.m. that morning. It was the last time he saw his wife alive.
Barbara then went back to bed as he left to go fishing. Throughout the initial interview with Eli, he denied having anything to do with the death and did not know what had happened.
To rule him out as a suspect, detectives ask Eli if he'll agree to a gunshot residue test. He agrees without hesitation.
A gunshot residue test, that's just a test to see if you have fired a gun or been in close proximity with your hands up. They came back negative.
After they were finished interviewing Eli, they also spoke to the individuals that Eli was fishing with.
He had an alibi that was able to be verified. He was on Lake Erie fishing with his friends.
With Eli eliminated as the triggerman and no clues pointing to other possible suspects, detectives follow up with those closest to the Weaver family. It isn't long before detectives are approached by Barbara's sister, who shares some unexpected and troubling family secrets.
Barbara's sister revealed that Eli had just a history of cheating and had several affairs behind Barbara's back. According to Barbara's sister, Eli's infidelity had been a huge problem throughout their entire marriage. In fact, it started back during Eli's Rumspringa when they first started dating. Eli was much wilder than Barbara, always partying, actually seeing people outside of the Amish faith. Eventually, he did come back and marry Barbara, but the temptation to leave, it seemed to always be there.
He just wanted to dabble in things that were forbidden. He seemed to have a real attraction to things that were forbidden.
According to her sister, Barbara had twice caught Eli having affairs during the course of their marriage. Both times he'd been seeing women from outside the Amish community. And each time, he'd temporarily left both his marriage and church.
The community found out very quickly, and Eli was immediately shunned until he repented for betraying both his wife and God.
He returned home. He would go to the bishop and apologize, and then he'd go home. He made promises to Barbara about changing.
You can't just walk away from the Amish faith and come back whenever you want. Every family is part of a local church. There are local bishops who have a lot of say in the Amish community. So to just come back and decide to be an Amish husband and father again would require a meeting with the church elders. And they would have to be convinced he's serious now, he means it, he's giving up this wayward lifestyle.
He supposedly made amends with Barbara and asked the church for their forgiveness.
For a devoted Amish woman like Barbara, divorce was not an option.
She was like every other Amish person. They feel very strongly that it's not right to divorce, and they just try their absolute utmost to try to stay together no matter what.
She didn't just stay in the marriage because she believed she had to. I think she stayed in the marriage because she wanted to. This is the man she chose to marry in front of God and in front of her church. I think she was as devoted to him as anyone would have been.
I think she had hope till the day she died. She had hope. She thought things were going to turn around.
But Barbara's sister reveals that not long before her death, Barbara had confided in her that she feared her husband might once again be straying from his marriage vows.
A few months before her death, Barbara told her sister that she was beginning to detect a little bit of distance growing between she and Eli, and that he was gone a lot more often. She was beginning to think that maybe he had a new girlfriend.
Barbara felt very devastated. She just wished so much that things could be different. She was really hurting.
She had also been scared. According to her sister, Barbara had worried that if Eli was cheating again, then the women he was seeing might wish her harm.
She'd told a friend she wasn't afraid of Eli, but she was afraid of Eli's girlfriends, and that somebody would be so jealous and wanting Eli so much that they would harm Barbara.
Was it possible a woman from outside the Weavers' marriage had targeted Barbara Weaver out of jealousy? Before investigators can follow up on that theory, the case takes an unexpected turn when police receive a bizarre call from the Weavers' next-door neighbor.
Detectives received a phone call from an individual saying there's a message on the community phone that detectives need to listen to. Detectives went down, listened to the voicemail.
There was a phone call made to the community phone that just said basically, you can run but you can't hide. We obviously got the wrong person last night, Eli.
The voicemail was something to the effect of, we missed this time, we'll get you next time.
Detectives in Wayne County, Ohio are investigating the brutal murder of 30-year-old Amish wife, Barbara Weaver, when they receive information that someone has threatened her husband Eli's life.
Now we know there's somebody out there that meant to kill Eli through some twist of fate. He was lucky that he was on this fishing trip and they just shot his wife. It made perfect sense to me.
On June 3rd, detectives confront Eli about his previous infidelities.
Eli did admit to cheating on his wife in the past. He said those days, though, were long over. In fact, it had been years since he had been in contact with any of his former lovers.
When detectives press Eli for details about his past affairs, however, Eli grows noticeably uncomfortable.
He got quiet and he refused to answer any more questions without an attorney.
Eli's attorney, Andrew Hyde, agrees with his client's decision to cut off the interview with police.
I remember telling them that I believed Eli was innocent. We would come and talk to him, but I wanted time to talk to him first, and we would cooperate fully. He needed to cooperate to help them find out whoever did this.
With Eli keeping quiet and no evidence pointing to a clear suspect, Detectives turn to the Amish community for clues. They quickly get a tip that suggests Barbara Weaver had been right to worry that her husband might be cheating again.
In the days after Barbara's murder, police got a lot of tips indicating that Eli had been spending a lot of time with someone referred to as the taxi lady. Apparently, she drove him all around town, on fishing trips, to the store, just about anywhere he needed to go.
The neighbors and friends of Barbara's and Eli's and told the sheriff's deputies, "You've got to talk to this friend of Eli's, whose name is Barb Raber, a Mennonite woman who drives the Amish around to various places because the Amish don't have vehicles."
The people police had been talking to said they didn't really have any hard evidence that Eli and Barb were having an affair, but they had seen them together. And they said there was something about their behavior that was just a little bit suspicious.
According to friends, Barb Raber had a deep connection to the local Amish community.
Barbara Raber was actually adopted and raised Amish.
She met Edward, her husband, and then at some point in their relationship, they left the Amish and joined a Mennonite church in the area.
Mennonites are less conservative than Amish. Mennonites can have vehicles, they can have cell phones, they can have televisions.
Somebody like that who has the ability to drive a car is sought out as somebody that a lot of people will be looking for someone like that as a driver. She knew most of the community. Everybody knew her, very small-knit community. And she made, I believe it was part-time, sometimes full-time job, just driving around Amish.
Detectives learn that Barb Raber and her husband live in nearby Millersburg.
They had a pretty house. They had a ski boat in the driveway. She had 3 young children.
That same day, detectives attempt to contact the 39-year-old on her cell phone.
Detectives asked if she would speak to them about the death of Barbara Weaver, and the first thing she said was, "Am I a suspect?" which, as you can imagine, raises concerns if you're a homicide detective.
Detectives assure Barb Raber they're just looking for more information about her relationship with Eli. She tells police that she and Eli became close 4 years earlier when she first began working as a taxi driver for the Amish. Eli had hired her to drive him around.
She helped him when he needed a ride, not just to go fishing or something, but when he needed anything. She did admit that she'd had this relationship with Eli that kind of crossed a lot of boundaries. He seemed to fill something in her life that nobody else filled. Eli and Barb began having a sexual relationship, in the car, in the barn, out in the trees, wherever they could. I just have to think she was looking for something to spice up her life.
Barb says the affair ended 6 months earlier, when both she and Eli realized their marriages would be threatened if they continued.
The intimate side of their relationship, I think, finally kind of died away.
She told them she continued to drive Eli and his friends around, but was never alone with Eli after that and had never spent any time around his wife, Barbara.
Detectives bring Barb Raber in for more questioning and press her about her whereabouts during the 24 hours before Barbara Weaver's body was found.
Barb Raber talked about driving Eli and his friends to Lake Erie the day before the murder.
She stated to the police that she came home that evening around 11 p.m., dropped them off, and then went home.
She said that she'd been at home all night, that her husband Ed was there. She said she had nothing to do with the murder.
Detectives will need to confirm Barb Raber's alibi with her husband. But before they can make arrangements to speak with him, police get a surprise phone call from a local resident.
This 25-year-old woman named Dandy contacted police and said that she had an affair with Eli and that Eli had made some pretty disturbing comments about his wife.
I actually called the Wayne County Sheriff's Office myself after I was notified of Barbara's murder.
Dandy tells police that her relationship with Eli began years earlier.
I met him online on a chat site called Moco Space about 2 years before.
Eli classified himself as the Amish stud in his online profile.
It very much attracted my attention. He told me he owned a small store that sold hunting and fishing stuff, and being kind of outdoorsy, it piqued my interest. He had a cell phone, and I knew he wasn't supposed to have it, but his excuse was for his business. He used the cell phone. I went out to the store a handful of times. You know, we'd sit around and drink coffee and just basically BS about life. He was very charismatic, not something that you would see coming from the stereotype of the Amish community. He was very outspoken, very opinionated, definitely wasn't shy.
According to Dandy, her affair with Eli had been brief.
We never spent a night together. It was literally when we had time, we would meet up during the day. Only a handful of times that it was ever anything of that nature. We had our fling and we went back to being friends, and it was strictly friends for well over a year before the murder happened.
Dandy tells detectives Eli appeared deeply unhappy in his marriage. But she says she became concerned when Eli's talk turned dark.
He had made comments to me that now were red flags. He would talk about wanting to know ways to basically kill somebody. He told me if I came out and I seen his wife in the driveway to run her over. He had made comments about knowing what mushrooms were poisonous, and that's when I had to kind of step back.
While Dandy claims she hasn't spoken to Eli in months, she agrees to cooperate with police.
They asked if I knew how to reach out to Eli, and the cell phone number that I had was disconnected. I told him if they put me on a computer and let me create an account on Moco, I knew that he would reach out to me because I didn't have an active account on there anymore. He put me on a computer, I created an account, I sent him a message and just said, "What in the heck is going on? I'm hearing so much. Call me." And I left him my number.
Minutes later, Eli calls back.
She talked to him on the phone and asked, "What are you up to, Eli?" And he said, "Well, I'm at my parents' house and somebody killed my wife."
And he was just so calm, and it was like there was no emotion behind what he said. I asked, "What in the heck happened?" He said he couldn't talk anymore, but he would call me back later. I never spoke with him again after that.
Thanks to Dandy's help, police now have Eli's secret cell phone number. They file a subpoena for his phone records.
The more police learned about Eli's cheating, the more they came back to the theory that he had something to do with her murder. In fact, they believe he may have even had some help because he was out of town. If Eli had conspired with someone else to kill his wife, police are hoping that cell phone records will reveal who that person was.
Coming up, new evidence brings a harrowing conspiracy into focus.
When a search warrant was conducted on the computer, there was over 800 searches made on that computer about how to poison a human being.
To me, that just shows the darkness that really creeped behind the facade that he lived.
Two days after the murder of Amish wife Barbara Weaver, detectives have discovered her husband Eli was living a secret double life when they find numerous dating profiles for the Amish father of 5.
He called himself an Amish stud online. The detectives wanted to talk to all of Eli's girlfriends, the women in this circle that he'd met when he was Amish stud.
Detectives tracked down several of Eli's girlfriends. Each one is cooperative and shares disturbing comments Eli had made to them.
He would just ask, do you know anybody that'll kill my wife? You know, he asked one girlfriend, when you see her next, would you run over her?
Several of the women appeared to be alarmed, even pushed back, saying, you can't be serious.
When he was confronted, he would laugh and say it was only a joke.
But as detectives dig deeper into Eli's secret life, they uncover the cell phone number he used had been associated with an account paid for by an individual familiar to police.
It turned out the cell phone wasn't in Eli's name. It was in Barb Raber's.
She gave him a cell phone, and he was on her friends and family plan. What they found was a lot of contact between Eli and Barb Raber. They texted like crazy.
That opened up a treasure trove of information in the investigation.
It was clear from the recent text that Barb and Eli were not just friends. They were very personal texts, very suggestive. It was obvious they were still having an affair. It was also very clear from their texting that Barb and Eli had some pretty dark ideas when it came to how they could continue to see each other.
There was a lot of text messages that were recovered on how to murder or to kill Barbara Weaver.
In the weeks leading up to Barbara Weaver's death, the communication between Eli and Barb Raber grew increasingly sinister.
There was a text that Barb Raber sent suggesting that they use sleeping pills, put it in a can of soda for Barbara to drink, and then put a gas can under her bed, so maybe she'd die of carbon monoxide poisoning.
They went on as far as talking about poison. Eli Weaver had gotten rat poisoning.
They talked about putting in a spice cupcake. At one point in time, Eli had asked Barbara Raber to just blow up the house. And she said, well, what about your children? And he said, that's okay, they're innocent, they'll go to heaven.
To me, that just shows the darkness that really creeped behind the facade that he lived.
Detectives also recover incriminating texts between Eli and Barb Raber from June 1st, the night before Barbara Weaver's body was discovered.
Barbara's texting Eli saying that she's afraid to go through with this. Eli is encouraging her to go ahead.
She literally texted him, where am I supposed to park? It's really dark. How will I see to get into the house?
He's telling her to take a flashlight. He directed her to park behind the pine trees so she wouldn't be seen. Told her he would leave the door open for her.
24 hours later, Barb Raber had sent Eli a final message.
There was text messages recovered from Barbara to Eli that were stating, please don't give your cell phone to the police, and that she was disconnecting his number and getting a new number for him.
On June 10th, police arrest both Eli Weaver and Barb Raber for murder.
Eli was arrested at his residence. At the same time, there was officers going to the residence of Barbara Raber.
She was very upset. Her knees buckled. They kind of had to carry her and drag her to the police car. I think Barb Raber was very surprised when she was arrested.
Police also recover Barb Raber's cell phone and computer. A forensic analysis provides more evidence against the 39-year-old Mennonite mother.
When a search warrant was conducted on the computer, there was over 800 searches made on that computer about how to poison a human being.
While the text messages themselves would be difficult to downplay, now you have over 800 internet searches, research into how to commit this crime. You can't play that off as a joke. That's determination.
When detectives sit down with Eli Weaver, he continues to claim innocence and refuses to cooperate with police any further. Barb Raber, on the other hand, agrees to talk.
She admitted that she had fallen in love with Eli, but Eli was concerned his wife was beginning to catch on. That's when she says that Eli convinced her that helping him kill his wife would be the way they could stay together because, of course, divorce is not an option in the Amish community.
The only way out of the marriage would be if your spouse would pass away. Then your marriage would no longer be in existence.
Barb agreed to help Eli. In fact, they even managed to set up where he would be out of town the night of the murder, so Eli would have an alibi.
Eli Weaver probably thought with his alibi of fishing on Lake Erie with friends who were with him all day, that he would have a very strong alibi.
Barb Raber describes in chilling detail how in the early morning hours of June 2nd, she snuck over to the Weavers' home with her husband's shotgun.
She talks about how she parked and walked through the woods. And if you remember, just like she had discussed on the text messages, parking by the pines, going through the woods, entered through the unlocked door, which in the text messages Eli had said would be unlocked.
She was definitely scared, telling Eli that she was scared, looking to him to encourage her, motivate her.
But Barb tells detectives that as she crept through the dark home, she suddenly got cold feet.
This is where we get into the realm of what I call a lie fashion. I did it, but.
Barbara Raber stated, "I was only there to scare her."
Barb tells police that she stood in the bedroom doorway as Barbara Weaver slept.
She said that the gun went off accidentally while she was standing in the doorway.
I was scared, I was just going to scare her, and I shot her accidentally. She is making admissions, but she's still downplaying her involvement.
Police really had a difficult time believing Barb's story about the gun accidentally going off. Still, she had admitted that she was there and that she pulled the trigger from the gun that ultimately took Barbara Weaver's life. That made her culpable of murder.
In June 2009, Amish father of 5, Eli Weaver, and his lover, Barb Raber, are indicted for the aggravated murder of Eli's wife, Barbara Weaver. On August 27, 2009, just weeks before Eli's trial is scheduled to begin, his defense team approaches the prosecution about a possible plea deal.
When you have two co-defendants, there's often a race to accept that plea deal in hopes of getting that lesser sentence.
Eli Weaver and his defense attorney had come up with a plea bargain that he would plead guilty to conspiracy to murder. Then he would testify against Barbara Raber at her trial.
They wanted a statement from him as to what his testimony would be. And if he were to lie or misstate anything in that statement, that all deals would be off and the statement could be used against him. So I wanted him, if he's going to take advantage of that plea bargain process, to understand he had to be honest and fill in all those details.
Eli now tries to push it off on Barb Raber by saying that she had said, well, if I kill your wife, we could be together more.
What was pretty interesting is Eli admitted to talking with Barb about killing his wife, and he never once said that he tried to talk her out of it. In fact, he went on and told investigators there was just no talking Barb out of doing something that she really wanted to do.
She just ran with it on her own.
Eli admits that in the early morning hours of June 2nd, he texted Barb Raber that he had left his basement door unlocked.
Eli left the house about 3:30 or 3:45 with his fishing buddies, and he began to get texts from Barb Raber pretty soon after that time.
He says he knew then that Barb had killed his wife. Throughout Eli's entire statement, he never showed any remorse. In fact, you could say he almost appeared cold, as if he was trying to distance himself from anything that had happened.
Barb Raber is also offered a plea deal. She turns it down.
Barb Raber really wanted a trial. She wanted to go to trial and prove her innocence.
She was still sticking with her story, that she just had a change of heart at the very end and that the gun accidentally went off.
On September 16, 2009, Barb's trial gets underway in Wooster, Ohio. Prosecutors paint Barb as a jealous woman, desperate to have Eli for herself.
She was hoping to eliminate her competition. Barbara Raber, her ultimate goal was that she wanted to be with Eli and felt that she couldn't be as long as Eli's wife was in the picture.
Prosecutors present Barb's text records and computer searches as damning evidence that the crime was premeditated. They also call a witness who testifies that Barb had asked him for a favor the morning after the murder.
He admitted that he received a call from Barbara Raber asking him to leave this phone message on Eli Weaver's home phone so police would not blame Eli for what happened to his wife.
But the state's star witness is Eli Weaver. In his testimony, Eli minimizes his involvement.
He was still trying to do what was best for Eli. Never intended this to happen, didn't think Barb was really going to do it, but did talk to her about it.
Barb's defense counters that the state has no solid evidence against her.
Despite Barb Raber's, momentary admission that it was an accident, they had no evidence placing her in the house. There was no DNA, there were no fingerprints of hers, there was no weapon. They could not place her in the house.
The defense is doing their job, and they're trying to get just even that one lone juror that they can kind of throw some suspicion on to Eli Weaver.
After a 3-day trial, the case goes to the jury.
Barb Raber was found guilty of aggravated murder and was sentenced to life in prison.
I think the earliest she's eligible for parole now is 23 years.
On August 17, 2009, Eli pleads guilty to complicity to commit murder and is sentenced to 15 years to life in prison.
Eli Weaver, selfish, self-centered, narcissistic. He destroyed his family. He destroyed his children's lives. He destroyed Barb Raber's life. He destroyed Barb Raber's children and family. Just never gave any thought to anybody else other than himself.
The true victims in this whole tragedy are the children. They essentially lost both mom and dad. They're the ones that suffered the most by one greedy individual.
For more than 4 decades, a name haunted California without ever having a face attached to it. He was known by different names in different cities, but the terror was the same. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and eventually the name that would become synonymous with one of the most infamous cold cases in American history, the Golden State Killer. He had disappeared into the years. He had survived the investigators who hunted him. He had survived changing technology, changing police departments, changing neighborhoods, and generations of detectives who inherited boxes of evidence from men and women who had once promised themselves they would never stop looking. Then, on an ordinary April morning in 2018, everything changed. A 72-year-old former police officer was taken into custody in Sacramento, and a mystery that had terrified California for more than 40 years suddenly had a name. But to understand why that arrest stunned investigators, why it seemed almost impossible, and why the case had refused to die, you have to go back to a California that looked very different from the one that finally caught him. It begins in the summer of 1976, when a woman in the Sacramento area became the victim of a terrifying attack that would become the opening chapter of a crime series stretching across the state. The attacker entered homes at night. He watched neighborhoods. He studied routines. He learned how people live behind closed doors. According to the FBI, his first known attack occurred on June 18, 1976, in the Rancho Cordova and Carmichael area of Sacramento. At first, investigators were dealing with what appeared to be separate crimes. A burglary here, a sexual assault there. Another frightened victim somewhere else. But patterns began to emerge. The intruder often entered through the rear of a residence, sometimes forcing his way through a door or window. He wore a mask. He used a flashlight. He moved through homes with a terrifying confidence, as if he had already studied the people inside. The neighborhoods began to change. Doors that had once been left unlocked were suddenly checked again and again. Families became suspicious of unfamiliar cars. People looked over their shoulders when walking home. Some residents bought dogs. Others changed locks. Some kept weapons close at night. The fear was not abstract anymore. It had entered bedrooms, hallways, garages, and backyards. FBI personnel later described the atmosphere in Sacramento as one of widespread fear, with residents taking extraordinary precautions because they believed the attacker could strike again at any time. And he did. The attacks continued. What investigators did not yet know was that they were not hunting a man responsible for a handful of isolated crimes. They were facing a predator who would eventually be linked to approximately 45 rapes, 12 murders, and more than 120 residential burglaries between 1976 and 1986. The numbers would later become staggering, but numbers could never fully describe what the crimes did to the people who survived them. For victims, there was no simple return to normal. A house was supposed to be a place of safety. A bedroom was supposed to be private. A locked door was supposed to mean something. The attacker turned all of those assumptions against them. He created a psychological weapon that continued working long after he disappeared. The investigation expanded rapidly, but so did the mystery. Detectives gathered descriptions. They compared reports. They searched for connections. They looked for witnesses. They studied the physical evidence left behind. But the suspect seemed to understand how to remain one step ahead. He was not simply committing crimes. He was exploiting the limitations of the era. There were no modern genetic genealogy databases waiting to compare distant relatives. There was no digital surveillance network covering residential streets. There was no massive national database capable of instantly connecting every fragment of evidence. Investigators had photographs, fingerprints when available, statements, sketches, physical evidence, and their own instincts. They had to build the case one piece at a time, and the killer kept moving. Sacramento was only the beginning. By 1979, the investigation was reaching other California communities. The offender's crimes began appearing farther from the original area, eventually extending into northern and southern California. The FBI later described a progression that included attacks in the East Bay and a series of murders along the California coast. The case was no longer local. It was becoming something much larger. Different jurisdictions had different detectives, different files, and different theories. The names attached to the suspect changed depending on where investigators were standing. In Sacramento, he became the East Area rapist. In Southern California, the crimes were connected to the original Night Stalker. Eventually, investigators realized they were dealing with the same offender. One man, multiple identities, multiple communities, a trail stretching hundreds of miles, and somewhere inside that trail was the answer. But the answer remained hidden. Years passed, then decades. The suspect vanished. There were no new confirmed crimes connected to him after 1986, when an 18-year-old woman was raped and murdered in Irvine. That silence created one of the greatest mysteries of the entire case. Had he died? Had he left California? Had he been imprisoned for another crime? Had he simply stopped, or was he still living somewhere among ordinary people, going to work, paying bills, greeting neighbors, and watching the world move forward while investigators continued searching for him? The possibility was terrifying, because if the killer was still alive, then somewhere out there was a man who knew exactly what he had done and knew that nobody had ever proven who he was. The years continued. Victims aged. Children grew up. Investigators retired. Detectives who had once chased the suspect became grandparents. Some evidence remained locked away in police facilities. Other evidence existed only in memories. But the case itself refused to disappear. It became one of those files that seemed almost impossible to close. Every so often, investigators returned to it. Every new technological development created another possibility. DNA evidence became increasingly important, biological evidence collected decades earlier could potentially speak in a way witnesses could not. A laboratory result did not care how much time had passed. It did not forget. It did not retire. It did not lose its memory. The evidence waited, and investigators knew that somewhere inside those old crime scenes might be the thread that could finally lead to the man behind the mask. In 2016, the FBI and local law enforcement agencies publicly renewed the search, launching a national campaign and offering a reward for information that could identify and convict the East Area rapist and Golden State Killer. The FBI emphasized that detectives possessed DNA evidence capable of linking or eliminating suspects. The message was clear. Time had not erased the case. 40 years had passed, but the investigation was alive. Somewhere the killer was still out there. Then came the technology that would change everything. The old evidence could now be examined through a completely different lens. Investigators were no longer limited to asking whether a suspect's DNA matched the evidence. They could ask whether the evidence pointed toward relatives of the unknown offender. That distinction would become the key. The killer had spent decades believing that anonymity protected him. But the world had changed around him. Millions of people were voluntarily placing their genetic information into databases for entirely different reasons. Family history, ancestry, curiosity, genealogy. They were searching for grandparents, cousins, distant relatives, and forgotten branches of their family tree. They did not know that one day, somewhere among those genetic connections, investigators would find a path leading toward one of California's most wanted men. The case had survived for decades because the killer had remained unknown, but the evidence had survived too. And now, the evidence was about to start talking in a language investigators had never been able to use before. The man who had disappeared into history had spent 40 years believing the past was behind him. He was wrong. The past was coming back, and this time, it had his DNA. For decades, the investigation had been trapped inside a simple question. Who was he? Detectives knew what he had done. They knew where many of the crimes had occurred. They had statements from survivors, physical evidence, photographs, sketches, reports, and eventually DNA that connected multiple attacks to the same unknown offender. But knowing that one man had committed the crimes was not the same as knowing his name. The evidence could tell investigators that the same biological profile appeared in different cases, yet it could not simply point to a driver's license and say, "There he is." That was the wall the investigation kept hitting, a wall built from time, technology, and the enormous size of California itself. Then forensic science began changing faster than the killer ever could have imagined. DNA testing had already transformed criminal investigations, but the most important breakthrough in this case would come from an unexpected direction. Investigators began considering genetic genealogy, a technique that could use a DNA profile from an unknown person and compare it against information from genealogy databases to identify possible relatives. Instead of searching directly for the killer, investigators could search through his family tree. It was a completely different way of thinking. Somewhere in that tree could be a cousin. Somewhere could be an aunt, an uncle, a distant relative. One branch could eventually lead to the man who had remained unidentified since the 1970s. The concept sounded almost impossible when measured against 4 decades of failure, but the case had one advantage that the killer could not erase. Biological evidence had survived. The DNA collected from crime scenes could still be examined, and unlike a frightened witness whose memory might fade, genetic evidence did not forget. It waited in silence. By the time investigators returned to the case with modern genetic tools, the country had entered an era in which millions of people were voluntarily exploring their ancestry. They were building family trees online. They were submitting genetic samples to commercial services. They were looking for connections to relatives they had never met. Nobody joining those databases was doing it to help identify the Golden State Killer. But investigators realized that the same family connections could potentially become the map they needed. In the spring of 2018, that possibility became real. Investigators uploaded the DNA profile associated with the unidentified offender to a genealogy database, according to accounts later given by investigators and prosecutors. The search did not immediately produce the name Joseph D'Angelo. It produced something more subtle. possible relatives, genetic relationships, branches of a family tree, and from those branches, investigators began reconstructing a path. This was not a single dramatic computer screen revealing a murderer's identity. It was painstaking investigative work. A genetic match could indicate a relative, but a relative is not the suspect. A family connection can stretch across generations and thousands of people. Investigators had to examine genealogical records, ages, locations, family relationships, and other information to determine which individuals could plausibly be connected to the unknown offender. Slowly, the enormous family tree began to narrow. Somewhere inside it was a man whose life had unfolded in California. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. Born in 1945, D'Angelo had worked as a police officer in California during the years when the crimes were occurring. That fact alone was not enough. Investigators could not simply decide that a former police officer must be the man they had been hunting. They needed evidence. They needed something stronger than coincidence. They needed DNA. And that requirement would lead investigators into one of the most extraordinary stages of the entire case. D'Angelo had lived for decades under circumstances that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. He had a home. He had a family. He had worked. He had grown old. The young man investigators were searching for in old sketches was now an elderly man. Time had transformed his appearance. The photographs from the 70s and 80s belonged to another era. The suspect's face had changed because every human face changes with age. But investigators now had something more reliable than appearance. They had genetics. The genealogical research eventually directed investigators toward D'Angelo as a possible suspect, but the case still had to be built carefully. Detectives needed to determine whether the DNA profile from the crime scenes matched D'Angelo. According to investigators, surveillance was conducted, and they obtained discarded genetic material from him. The testing produced the result that changed the investigation forever. The DNA from D'Angelo was consistent with the biological evidence from the crimes. Suddenly, the man who had existed for decades only as a shadow had a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. 72 years old, a former police officer, a man living in Sacramento County. The case that had once seemed almost impossible had finally reached a specific human being. But even then, investigators did not rush to celebrate. They had spent too many years watching leads disappear. They knew that one mistake could damage a case that had survived for generations. The evidence had to be overwhelming. The investigators had to be certain. And as they assembled the case, a disturbing question began to emerge. How had a man who spent part of his career in law enforcement managed to remain unidentified for so long? The answer was not necessarily that he had possessed some extraordinary ability to escape detection. Sometimes a cold case survives because of something much simpler. Technology changes, agencies change, people retire, files move, investigators die, communities change, the suspect grows older, the original witnesses grow old. Evidence remains, but the people who once understood its context may no longer be there. In the Golden State Killer investigation, however, one thing remained constant across the decades: the DNA profile. That invisible biological signature had connected crimes long before investigators knew the identity of the offender. It had linked cases across jurisdictions. It had helped establish that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person, and now it was pointing directly toward Joseph D'Angelo. On April 24th, 2018, investigators moved. D'Angelo was arrested outside his home in Citrus Heights, California. The arrest was almost surreal in its simplicity. There was no dramatic chase across state lines, no fugitive hiding in a remote wilderness, no final confrontation in an abandoned building. The man investigators had searched for since the 1970s was living in a suburban community. He was 72 years old. He had spent decades growing older while the case remained open. Then, in a matter of moments, the life he had built around his anonymity began to collapse. News of the arrest spread rapidly. For survivors and families connected to the case, the announcement was more than a headline. It was the sudden transformation of a question that had lasted 40 years. Who was he? Now they knew. But another question immediately followed. Was this really the man responsible for the crimes that had haunted California for decades? Investigators believed the evidence would answer that question. The DNA evidence was central. So were the investigative links developed through the genealogy work. The case had moved from uncertainty to a specific suspect, but the legal process still had to determine responsibility. Meanwhile, the public began learning more about the man behind the name. The Golden State Killer had been one of America's most notorious unknown offenders. His identity had been the subject of speculation for years. There had been theories, suspects, false leads, and countless hours of police work. Some investigators had spent portions of their careers pursuing him. Others had inherited the case from detectives who had already retired. The arrest represented an extraordinary moment for law enforcement, but it also raised an unsettling possibility. If investigators had finally identified him, what else could be learned from the evidence? How many crimes could be connected to him with certainty? How many victims had been waiting for answers? And what had allowed the case to remain unsolved for so long? Those questions became especially important because the Golden State Killer investigation was never simply about one offender. It was about the enormous human cost of an unsolved case. A cold case does not freeze time for the people involved. Families continue living with uncertainty. Survivors continue carrying memories. Communities continue wondering whether the person responsible was ever caught. Every year that passes can make the truth seem less reachable. In this case, 40 years had passed, yet the DNA had remained, the science had evolved, and the investigation had found a way to connect the unknown biological profile to a living man. That was the extraordinary lesson hidden inside the arrest. The killer had not been defeated by a confession made decades earlier. He had not been identified because somebody suddenly remembered his fate. He had not been caught because a dramatic witness walked into a police station after 40 years and revealed the secret. He was identified because science had created a new path through an old mystery. The path began with DNA. It moved through genealogy. It traveled across family connection, and eventually it led investigators to a 72-year-old former police officer living in Sacramento County. But identifying the suspect was only the beginning of the final chapter. Investigators now had to prove what they believed. Prosecutors had to present the evidence in court. Survivors and families had to face the man whose name had finally replaced the anonymous figure who had haunted them for decades. And D'Angelo himself would soon stand before a court and confront the crimes that had followed him across more than 4 decades. The silence surrounding the case had been broken. The unknown man finally had a name. But the most haunting part of the story was that the evidence had been waiting all along. Somewhere inside the old files, inside the preserved biological material, inside the memories of victims and investigators, the truth had survived the passage of time. The killer had grown older. The world had changed. Technology had changed. California had changed. But the evidence had remained. And now that evidence had finally brought the Golden State Killer out of the shadows. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo did not bring an immediate sense of closure. It brought something more complicated. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer had existed as a faceless figure in the memories of survivors, in police files, in courtroom records, in sketches that attempted to capture a face that had seemed almost impossible to hold on to. Now the man behind that shadow was 72 years old, living in the same region where the investigation had begun. The revelation was almost too ordinary for a case that had been anything but ordinary. Neighbors looked at the photographs and heard the name, trying to reconcile the elderly man arrested in 2018 with the young suspect described decades earlier. But investigators had spent months building the case before making the arrest, and the DNA evidence was the bridge between the two images. The man they had taken into custody was not merely someone who happened to resemble an old police sketch. His genetic profile connected him to the biological evidence preserved from the crime. That scientific connection transformed a decades-old mystery into a criminal prosecution. The investigation now entered a new phase, one that would unfold not in dark streets or abandoned crime scenes, but inside courtrooms, evidence rooms, laboratories, and the memories of people who had waited years for the unknown offender to be identified. The scale of the case became clearer as prosecutors reviewed the evidence. The FBI had previously described the offender as responsible for approximately 45 sexual assaults, 12 killings, and more than 120 burglaries committed between 1976 and 1986. Those figures represented an enormous investigation involving multiple jurisdictions and generations of law enforcement officers, yet the prosecution would focus on specific crimes that could be charged and supported with evidence. The case against D'Angelo was not built solely on the genealogy investigation. Genetic genealogy had helped investigators find him, but the courtroom required additional proof. Investigators worked to establish the connection between D'Angelo and individual crimes. Old evidence was examined again. Records were reviewed. Investigators revisited details that had been collected decades earlier. Every piece mattered because a cold case does not become simple merely because a suspect has finally been identified. The arrest answered one question, but it created dozens more. Could investigators prove that D'Angelo was responsible for the murders associated with the original Night Stalker? Could they connect him to the East Area rapist attacks? Could the evidence survive legal scrutiny after so many years? And perhaps most importantly, what would the survivors say when they finally saw the person accused of destroying a part of their lives? Those questions followed the case into the courtroom. D'Angelo was charged with multiple counts of murder and other offenses. The charges reflected only a portion of the crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer. Some offenses could no longer be prosecuted because of the laws and circumstances surrounding them, while others were incorporated into the broader case through the prosecution's evidence and legal strategy. The passage of time had created another obstacle. Memories had aged. Documents had aged. Some witnesses were no longer alive. Some investigators who had worked the original cases had passed away. Yet the case moved forward. In 2020, the courtroom became the center of the story. The man who had once been described as an unidentified predator now appeared publicly as Joseph D'Angelo, the defendant. He was no longer a sketch. He was no longer a collection of aliases. He was no longer simply the East Area rapist or the original Night Stalker. He was a named defendant facing the consequences of crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. Then came one of the most consequential moments of the prosecution. D'Angelo admitted responsibility for numerous crimes. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges as part of an agreement that allowed prosecutors to avoid the uncertainty and prolonged trauma of a full trial while ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The plea did something the investigation had been unable to achieve for 4 decades. It placed the truth into a legal record. The anonymous offender had finally spoken through a courtroom admission. For many survivors and families, the moment was deeply emotional. Some people who had spent decades wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified now knew who he was. Others had spent years fearing that the case would die with the original investigator. Instead, the case had reached a courtroom, and the path to that courtroom had been unlike almost any investigation before it. Genetic genealogy had become the critical breakthrough. The technique demonstrated how investigators could use relatives of an unknown suspect to build a family tree and narrow the search. It was a revolutionary development in forensic investigation, but it also raised difficult questions about privacy, ethics, and the future of criminal investigations. If investigators could identify one person through the genetic information of distant relatives, what did that mean for everyone who had submitted DNA for ancestry research? The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark example of both the power and complexity of genetic genealogy. The technology had solved a mystery that had resisted conventional investigation for decades, but it also opened a door that law enforcement agencies around the world would increasingly consider. The case became a demonstration that a person could leave a biological trail without ever realizing it. D'Angelo may have believed that the passage of time had erased his connection to the crime, but DNA did not experience time in the same way humans did. The evidence remained, and when technology caught up with it, the old trail became visible again. The most remarkable aspect of the case was not simply that investigators found D'Angelo. It was how close the investigation had come to being permanently buried by history. Imagine the timeline. In 1976, the attacks began. In the following years, the crimes continued. In 1986, the final known attack attributed to the offender occurred. Then, nothing. Years became decades. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. A person born when the first attacks occurred could have grown from childhood into middle age before the case was solved. Entire generations grew up knowing the name Golden State Killer without knowing the face. And yet, beneath that long silence, the investigation remained alive. Detectives continued searching. Evidence remained preserved. The DNA profile continued to exist. The technology simply had not yet reached the point where investigators could use it in the way they eventually did. That distinction is critical. Cold cases are sometimes described as forgotten cases, but the Golden State Killer investigation was never truly forgotten. It was dormant, repeatedly revisited, and repeatedly challenged by the limitations of available evidence. Investigators had known for years that DNA connected the crimes. The problem was not proving that the same offender had committed them. The problem was attaching a name to the biological profile. Genetic genealogy changed that equation. It turned a search for one unknown man into a search through a network of biological relationships. Instead of asking, "Who is this DNA profile?" investigators could ask, "Who is related to this DNA profile?" That question produced possibility. Possibilities became family trees. Family trees became suspects. And one suspect eventually became Joseph D'Angelo. The arrest itself, therefore, represented the collision of two eras. The first era was the era of traditional detective work, when investigators went door to door, interviewed witnesses, studied crime scenes, compared reports, and created sketches. The second was the era of genetic databases, computational analysis, and genealogical reconstruction. The case could not have been solved by one era alone. The old investigation had preserved the evidence necessary for the new technology to work. Without the DNA collected decades earlier, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. Without modern genealogy techniques, the DNA might have remained an unidentified profile. The breakthrough existed at the intersection of both. That is what made the case so extraordinary. It was not simply a story about technology replacing detective work. It was a story about evidence surviving long enough for new science to give it meaning. And as D'Angelo's case moved towards sentencing, the public began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. A man who had once seemed untouchable had finally been identified. A case that had become a symbol of investigative failure had become a symbol of investigative persistence. The phrase cold case suddenly carried a different meaning. Cold did not mean dead. It did not mean impossible. It meant waiting. The evidence had been waiting. The investigators had been waiting. The families had been waiting. And after more than 4 decades, the waiting had ended. But the end of the investigation did not erase what had happened. It did not return the years that survivors had spent living with fear and uncertainty. It did not restore the people who had been killed. It did not undo the consequences of crimes that had altered families forever. What it did was establish a truth that had been missing for generations. The Golden State Killer had a name. Joseph James D'Angelo was no longer an unknown figure hiding behind an alias. He was a convicted criminal whose own admissions and the evidence against him had finally transformed a decades-old mystery into a matter of public record. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence formally ended the prosecution, but the story did not end there because the case had become larger than one courtroom. It had become a warning about time, evidence, memory, and the unpredictable power of science. Somewhere in those 40 years, investigators had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that the answer might never come. Yet the answer had been sitting inside evidence collected decades earlier. It had survived storage rooms, changing departments, retiring detectives, new generations, and the slow erosion of memory. It survived because evidence does not need to know when it will become useful. It only needs to survive until someone discovers how to read it. And the Golden State Killer case proved just how powerful that principle could be. For 40 years, the killer believed that the past had disappeared behind him. But the past had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the right technology, the right investigators, and the right genetic connection to bring it back into the light. The name Joseph James D'Angelo changed the Golden State Killer investigation forever, but it did not erase the 40 years that came before it. Behind the headlines and the images of police vehicles outside a Sacramento County home was a much older story, one that had begun in quiet California neighborhoods when the idea of a predator moving from house to house seemed almost impossible. The man investigators eventually identified had been only one part of the mystery. The other part was understanding how the crimes had spread across communities, how the investigation had evolved, and why the offender had remained unidentified for so long. In the beginning, detectives were not searching for the Golden State Killer. That name did not exist. They were searching for the East Area Rapist, an unknown intruder whose attacks in the Sacramento area created fear among residents and frustration among investigators. The offender appeared to understand his surroundings. He targeted residential areas, watched routines, and repeatedly demonstrated an ability to enter homes without immediately being identified. Investigators collected descriptions from survivors, searched for physical evidence, and tried to determine whether apparently separate incidents were connected. The challenge was enormous. There was no single crime scene that revealed the entire picture. Each investigation began with fragments: a report, a description, a footprint, a piece of biological evidence, a suspicious vehicle, a witness who remembered something unusual, a survivor trying to reconstruct a terrifying night. Individually, the fragments seemed incomplete. Together, over time, they formed a pattern. The pattern was the thing that investigators eventually learned to recognize. The same offender appeared to be moving through different neighborhoods. The same methods appeared again and again. The same psychological pressure appeared in different cases. And then, as the years passed, the geographical pattern expanded. The crimes moved beyond the Sacramento area. The offender eventually became associated with attacks in other Northern California communities and later with murders in Southern California. The change in geography created another enormous investigative problem. Police agencies were separated by jurisdiction. Information did not move as quickly as it does today. A detective working one series of crimes might not immediately know what another department hundreds of miles away was investigating. The technology available to investigators was primitive compared with the digital systems of the 21st century. There was no instant nationwide search engine for every police report. There was no social media network through which a photograph could be shared with millions of people within minutes. There was no consumer genetic database capable of revealing distant family connections. The investigation depended heavily on people. People had to recognize patterns. People had to communicate. People had to remember. People had to preserve evidence. And people could make mistakes. That human element became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The investigation survived because detectives continued comparing information and eventually connected crimes that had initially been treated as separate. But the offender benefited from the same fragmentation. He crossed invisible boundaries between jurisdictions. He committed crimes in different communities. He changed the way he operated. He disappeared between incidents. Every new crime created another mountain of evidence, but every new location created another challenge. As the investigation continued, the public began to understand that the offender was not simply a local criminal. He was becoming a statewide threat. Residents changed their routines. Security became a greater concern. People became suspicious of strangers. Families talked about locking doors and windows. The fear spread because the offender had created uncertainty. Nobody knew where he would appear next. Nobody knew what he looked like with certainty. Nobody knew when he would stop. The investigation, therefore, became more than a police operation. It became part of everyday life for communities that believed they might be next. But while the public experienced the crimes through fear, investigators experienced them through evidence. Every scene had to be documented. Every statement had to be recorded. Every possible clue had to be considered. Over time, investigators developed a profile of the offender based on his behavior and the evidence available to them. They learned that he was organized enough to plan his attacks and cautious enough to avoid leaving obvious identifying information. They also learned that he appeared to have detailed knowledge of the areas where he operated. Those observations became part of the larger attempt to understand who he might be. Was he local? Was he familiar with police procedures? Did he have military training? Did he have law enforcement experience? Did he have knowledge of neighborhoods from his job? These were questions investigators considered over the years, but a theory is not a conviction. Detectives needed evidence that could survive in court, and for decades they did not have the crucial piece. They had the biological evidence, but they did not have a name to attach to it. That distinction would become the central mystery of the entire investigation. The DNA profile could demonstrate that multiple crimes were connected. It could potentially eliminate suspects, but without a database containing the offender's identity, the profile remained essentially an anonymous signature. The killer had left behind something uniquely identifying, yet that identifier was useless unless investigators could find its owner. That was the paradox. The evidence was strong, but the suspect remained invisible. As forensic science developed during the 1980s and 90s, DNA became increasingly important in criminal investigations. Investigators learned how powerful biological evidence could be. A fingerprint could disappear or be difficult to recover. A witness could forget. A suspect could change appearance. But DNA could establish a connection between a person and a crime seen with extraordinary precision. The Golden State Killer investigation, therefore, entered a strange period. The case was stronger scientifically than ever before, yet the identity of the offender remained unknown. The investigation had evidence of the person, but not the person himself. It was like possessing a key without knowing which door it opened. Meanwhile, decades continued to pass. The victims and survivors aged. The investigators aged. The suspect aged. California changed around the case. Neighborhoods changed. Buildings were demolished or renovated. Roads were widened. Families moved away. New residents arrived who had never heard the old stories. Yet the case remained embedded in law enforcement records. Then, in the early 21st century, forensic technology began to create possibilities that detectives from the 1970s could never have imagined. DNA databases expanded. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators became better at extracting and preserving genetic information. The concept of genetic genealogy began emerging as a potential investigative tool. Instead of looking only for an exact match, investigators could look for relatives. That meant a suspect could potentially be identified even if he had never submitted his own DNA to a law enforcement database. A cousin might have. A distant relative might have. Someone researching their ancestry might unknowingly provide the genetic link needed to build a family tree. The concept was revolutionary. It also required extraordinary investigative discipline. A genetic relationship was not proof of guilt. It was a lead. Investigators had to build the bridge from the genetic connection to the actual suspect through traditional police work. They had to examine family records, ages, locations, relationships, and other evidence. They had to eliminate people who did not fit. They had to ensure that the final suspect was supported by independent evidence. That is precisely what happened in the Golden State Killer investigation. Genetic genealogy did not simply announce a name, it helped narrow the universe of possible suspects until investigators reached a man whose background made further investigation possible. Joseph D'Angelo became that man. But even then, the investigation did not stop. Detectives needed direct genetic evidence. They needed to compare his DNA to the crime scene profile. That final comparison transformed a genealogical lead into a prosecutable case. The significance of that process cannot be overstated. For decades, investigators had been trying to move from evidence to identity. Genetic genealogy finally provided a bridge. The DNA profile had existed for years, but the family connections surrounding it had been invisible. Once those connections became visible, the investigation could move forward. This was the moment when the case stopped being a historical mystery and became an active investigation again. Detectives were no longer asking whether the Golden State Killer could ever be identified. They were examining whether the man in front of them was the person responsible for crimes that had shaped California history. The answer came through the evidence, and on April 24, 2018, the arrest of D'Angelo announced to the world that the 40-year mystery had finally been broken. But for many people, the most shocking part was not the arrest itself. It was the realization that the man investigators had been searching for had been living an ordinary life while the case became one of America's most famous cold cases. The contrast was difficult to comprehend. A criminal investigation had occupied decades of police work, yet the suspect had continued living beyond the reach of law enforcement. He had grown old while the case grew cold. He had watched technology transform society while the old evidence remained hidden in storage. He had seen DNA become a revolutionary forensic tool. He had lived through the rise of the internet. He had witnessed genealogy databases become part of popular culture. And somewhere along the way, the technology that would eventually expose him had been developing without him knowing that it would become his greatest threat. That is the strange irony of the case. The killer's greatest advantage had been time. Time separated him from the crimes. Time changed his appearance. Time weakened memory. Time allowed the original investigation to fade from public attention. But time also transformed forensic science. The same decades that helped conceal him also created the technology that eventually identified him. The case therefore became a battle between two forces moving in opposite directions. The suspect was becoming harder to recognize, while the evidence was becoming easier to interpret. For years, the suspect appeared to be winning. Then the balance shifted. Suddenly, 40 years of silence could be examined through a new scientific lens. The old evidence was not old anymore. It was newly useful, and when investigators finally connected that evidence to Joseph D'Angelo, one of the longest and most notorious cold cases in American history moved into its final stage. The question was no longer whether the Golden State Killer existed. The question was how much of the past could finally be proven, how many victims could finally receive answers, and how the justice system would confront a man whose crimes had crossed generations. The shadow had a name now. The mask had been removed, but the full weight of the case had yet to be revealed. The arrest had solved the mystery of identity, but it had not erased the mystery of the crimes themselves. For investigators, the months after Joseph D'Angelo's arrest became a race against time of a different kind. The question was no longer, who is the Golden State Killer? It was, what can still be proven after more than 40 years? Every old report suddenly mattered. Every piece of preserved evidence had new significance. Every survivor's statement could potentially help connect an event from the 1970s or 80s to the man now sitting in custody. The investigation that had once been scattered across decades and jurisdictions was being reconstructed with a new focus. The name on the file was no longer unknown. Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer, a 72-year-old man, a suspect whose DNA had finally provided the direct link investigators had spent generations searching for. But the legal system demanded more than a dramatic arrest. Prosecutors had to demonstrate the strength of the evidence. They had to establish connections between D'Angelo and specific crime. They had to confront the passage of time, the disappearance of witnesses, and the fading memories of people who had lived with the case for most of their adult lives. The scale of the investigation was enormous. The FBI had described the offender as being connected to approximately 45 sexual assaults, 12 murders, and more than 120 burglaries committed between 1976 and 1986. Those numbers represented years of investigation and countless individual pieces of evidence. Yet the criminal case would ultimately focus on charges that could be proven within the applicable legal framework. Investigators began examining the old cases again with modern forensic tools and the knowledge that they finally had a confirmed suspect. A case that had once been viewed through the lens of an unidentified predator could now be examined through the biography of a specific man. His employment history, his residences, his movements, his relationships, his age, his connection to California community. Every detail became relevant because investigators needed to determine whether the man identified through genetic genealogy was also the man responsible for the individual crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer. The answer increasingly appeared to be yes, but the emotional dimension of the case was impossible to ignore. For decades, survivors had lived without knowing the identity of the person who had entered their lives in the most frightening way imaginable. Some had been children when the crimes occurred. Some had spent their entire adult lives carrying the knowledge that the offender remained unidentified. Some had watched investigators retire. Some had watched new technologies emerge and wondered whether any of them would ever be enough. The arrest changed that reality overnight. Suddenly, the unknown offender was a real person. His photograph appeared on television. His name was printed in newspapers. His age became public. His history was examined. The mysterious figure who had once seemed almost mythical had become an elderly defendant sitting behind a legal barrier. The transformation was extraordinary. The public had spent decades imagining what the killer might look like. Investigators had created sketches based on descriptions from survivors. Those sketches became part of the cultural memory of the case. But now there was a photograph, a real face, a real name, a real defendant, and that face belonged to someone who had grown old while the case remained unsolved. The contrast between the old sketches and the man arrested in 2018 became one of the most unsettling aspects of the story. Time had hidden him in plain sight, but the investigation was not built on his appearance. It was built on evidence. That evidence eventually became strong enough for prosecutors to move forward with a massive criminal case. In Sacramento County, charges were filed in connection with murders and other offenses attributed to the Golden State Killer. Additional charges followed as prosecutors developed the case. The legal process began transforming decades of investigative work into formal allegations. But as the case advanced, another reality became clear. A traditional trial could be extraordinarily long and painful. There were many victims and survivors. There were many crimes. There were decades of history. Every detail would have to be presented and examined. Survivors might have to revisit events that had shaped their lives. Families of victims might have to sit through extensive proceedings. Prosecutors would need to present evidence from crimes that had occurred when some members of the legal team were not even alive. The possibility of a full trial therefore carried enormous emotional and logistical consequences. Then D'Angelo made a decision that changed the direction of the case. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement allowed prosecutors to secure life sentences without the possibility of parole while avoiding the uncertainty and prolonged trauma of a full trial. The admission was a dramatic turning point. For decades, investigators had been trying to attach the Golden State Killer's crimes to a human identity. Now the defendant himself was admitting responsibility for a significant portion of them. The courtroom became a place where the anonymous figure of the past and the elderly defendant of the present finally became the same person in the official record. The plea also provided a form of certainty that had been missing for decades. Families no longer had to wonder whether the wrong man had been arrested. Survivors no longer had to wonder whether the person responsible would escape the justice system because of the passage of time. The legal record now contained D'Angelo's admissions, but the emotional consequences could not be resolved by a guilty plea. In the courtroom, victims and their relatives had an opportunity to speak. Their statements brought the human dimension of the case into focus. The Golden State Killer had often been described through statistics, aliases, maps, and investigative terminology. But the people affected by his crimes were not statistics. They were individuals whose lives had been permanently altered. Their families had lost loved ones. Survivors had carried memories for decades. The court proceedings allowed some of them to confront the man who had remained unknown for so long. The process was not about restoring the past. That was impossible. It was about establishing accountability. The sentence would not erase the crimes. It would not return lost lives. It would not remove decades of fear. But it would establish that the man responsible would spend the rest of his life in prison. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence marked the formal conclusion of the prosecution, but the story of the investigation continued to resonate far beyond California. The case had become a landmark in the use of genetic genealogy. Before the Golden State Killer investigation, the idea that police could identify an unknown suspect through distant relatives in consumer genealogy databases was still largely unfamiliar to the public. After the case, the technique attracted enormous attention. Investigators around the country began examining whether similar methods could help solve other cold cases. For families waiting decades for answers, the development offered something that had previously seemed impossible. If DNA from an unidentified offender had survived, perhaps another cold case could also be reopened. Perhaps an unknown victim could be identified. Perhaps a murderer who had escaped detection for decades could suddenly become vulnerable to a technology that did not exist when the crime occurred. But the same technology raised difficult questions. Genetic information is deeply personal. People who submitted DNA to genealogy services generally did so for family research, not to become part of criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer case therefore forced society to confront a new reality. Scientific progress could solve crimes, but it could also create questions about privacy and consent. If investigators could use one person's genetic information to identify another person, where should the boundaries be drawn? What rules should govern access? How should databases be used? What protections should exist for people who never intended their DNA to become investigative evidence? These questions would become part of the larger legacy of the case, yet for survivors and families, the most immediate fact remained much simpler. The man they had been waiting for had been found. The 40-year search was over. The case had moved from uncertainty to accountability, and the discovery had come not through a dramatic confession at the beginning, but through a chain of evidence that began decades earlier and survived long enough for modern science to unlock it. The Golden State Killer had counted on the passage of time. Time had separated him from the crimes. Time had changed his fate. Time had changed the neighborhoods. Time had changed the investigators. But time had also created the technology that would eventually expose him. That was the paradox at the heart of the entire investigation. The same years that appeared to protect the offender were quietly strengthening the tools that could eventually identify him. Every decade brought new forensic possibilities. Every technological advance made old evidence more valuable. And when genetic genealogy finally connected the unknown DNA profile to a family tree, the wall that had protected the killer for 40 years began to collapse. The case became a lesson in persistence. It showed that a cold case can appear silent without being dead. Evidence can wait. Technology can change. Investigators can return to old questions with new tools. And sometimes the answer is not discovered because somebody finally remembers what happened. Sometimes the answer is discovered because science finds a way to read what was already there. For Joseph D'Angelo, that evidence became the end of his freedom. For the survivors, it became the beginning of a different chapter. For investigators, it became proof that a case thought to be nearly impossible could still be solved. And for the world, the Golden State Killer became one of the most powerful examples of how modern forensic science could reach backward through decades of silence and bring an unknown criminal into the light. The courtroom had finally given the Golden State Killer a name, a face, and a sentence. But the most remarkable part of the story remained the road that had led there. For more than 40 years, investigators had carried the weight of an unanswered question, and that question had survived every technological revolution that seemed capable of solving it. The case had begun in an era when police work depended heavily on handwritten reports, physical files, witness recollections, and detectives who knew their communities almost street by street. By the time Joseph D'Angelo was arrested, investigators had access to technologies that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first entered those crime scenes. Yet the old evidence had remained at the center of everything. It was the bridge between two different worlds. In the first world, investigators were trying to understand a mysterious offender who seemed to know exactly how to exploit the weaknesses of residential neighborhoods. In the second, forensic scientists were able to extract meaning from biological material collected decades earlier. Between those worlds was a trail of evidence that never stopped existing, even when the investigation appeared to slow down. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated something that cold case investigators have understood for years. Time can destroy evidence, but it can also preserve it in unexpected ways. A fingerprint may fade, a witness may forget, a photograph may deteriorate, a detective may retire, but biological evidence can remain useful for generations if it is properly collected and preserved. That fact became critical to the investigation because the DNA profile associated with the offender had already connected crimes long before investigators knew his identity. The genetic evidence established a powerful continuity across cases that occurred in different places and at different times. It helped investigators understand that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were not separate offenders, different names attached to the same unknown man. That realization alone was significant. It allowed law enforcement to view decades of crimes as one enormous investigation rather than as unrelated cases scattered across California. But even with that connection established, the central mystery remained. Who was the man behind the DNA? That question had resisted traditional investigation for years. Suspects were considered, leads were examined. The investigation generated theories, but theories could not replace proof. A person could resemble an old sketch. A person could have lived in the right area. A person could have worked in a profession investigators found interesting. None of those facts could establish guilt. The breakthrough had to come from evidence capable of directly connecting a suspect to the crimes. Genetic genealogy provided the missing route. It was not magic. It did not instantly reveal the killer's identity. It created a trail that investigators could follow. The unknown DNA profile was compared against genetic information available through genealogy research. The results suggested distant family relationships. Investigators then began reconstructing the possible family tree. Every branch created more possibilities. Every generation expanded the number of people who could potentially be related to the unknown offender. But with careful genealogical research, the investigators could narrow the field. They considered birth dates. They considered location. They considered family structures. They considered whether individuals had lived in areas relevant to the crimes. They examined information that could eliminate people as well as information that could place them on the list. Eventually, the name Joseph D'Angelo emerged as a viable suspect. That was the moment when the investigation changed from a historical search into an active operation. But there was still a crucial distinction. A genealogical connection could identify a possible suspect. It could not prove that the suspect had committed a crime. Investigators therefore needed direct DNA evidence from D'Angelo. According to investigators, they obtained discarded genetic material and compared it with the evidence profile. The result provided the connection they needed. The science had transformed an unknown biological signature into a specific individual, and suddenly, the case that had once seemed permanently frozen was moving at extraordinary speed. The arrest on April 24th, 2018 was the visible consequence of that invisible scientific process. To the public, it looked like a mystery had suddenly been solved. In reality, the breakthrough was the product of decades of work. The detectives who first collected evidence could not have known exactly how important it would become. The forensic scientists who preserved and analyzed the DNA could not have known when the answer would emerge. The genealogical researchers could not have known which branch of a family tree would lead to the suspect. The final result depended on all of those efforts converging at the right moment. That is why the Golden State Killer case became such an important turning point in criminal investigation. It demonstrated that an investigation does not necessarily become obsolete simply because it becomes old. A case can remain dormant while the evidence waits for technology to catch up. The Golden State Killer was not identified because investigators suddenly discovered a forgotten confession. He was identified because a new investigative method allowed old evidence to reveal information that had previously been inaccessible. That distinction changed the way law enforcement looked at cold cases. If genetic genealogy could identify a suspect after more than 40 years, what other cases might be waiting for the same breakthrough? Across the United States, investigators began revisiting old evidence. Some agencies examined unidentified DNA profile. Others explored whether genealogy databases could help identify unknown suspects or unidentified remains. The Golden State Killer investigation became a model for a new era of cold casework. But with that new power came responsibility. Genetic genealogy could reveal relationships that people never expected investigators to examine. A person's DNA could potentially help identify another person even if the second person had never submitted genetic information themselves. The implications were enormous. Law enforcement had gained a powerful tool, but society had to decide how that tool should be used. The debate became part of the case's legacy. Supporters pointed to the victims and families who had waited decades for justice. Critics raised questions about privacy, consent, and the boundaries of genetic surveillance. The Golden State Killer case therefore became more than a criminal investigation. It became a test of how far modern forensic science should reach into private lives. Yet the emotional heart of the story remained with the people who had lived through the crimes. For them, technology was not an abstract debate. It was the reason the person who had haunted their memories finally had a name. The years of uncertainty had been replaced by certainty. That certainty was painful, but it was different from not knowing. An unsolved case can create a permanent question. Families can spend decades wondering whether the truth will ever emerge. Survivors can wonder whether the person responsible is still somewhere nearby. Every anniversary can reopen the uncertainty. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated what happens when that uncertainty finally ends. The answer does not erase the past. It changes the relationship with the past. The survivors no longer had to imagine an unknown offender. They knew who had been responsible. The families of victims no longer had to wonder whether justice would ever reach the person connected to the crimes. The legal system had acted. D'Angelo had pleaded guilty. He had been sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without parole. The case had reached a legal conclusion. But legal closure and emotional closure are not identical. A sentence can end a prosecution. It cannot erase memory. It cannot restore a life. It cannot give someone back 40 years. That reality became clear during the sentencing proceedings when victims and their relatives confronted the defendant and described the impact the crimes had on their lives. The courtroom became a place where decades of silence were finally broken. People who had once been represented only by numbers in investigative files were able to speak as individuals. Their stories reminded everyone that behind the famous cold case was a collection of human lives. The Golden State Killer had been described in headlines, documentaries, police reports, and television broadcasts. But the people who survived his crimes had never experienced him as a headline. They experienced him as a moment that changed everything. That distinction is important. The public saw the mystery. The victims lived the consequences. For decades, the mystery dominated the story because the offender's identity was unknown. Once D'Angelo was identified, the focus began shifting back toward the people whose lives had been affected. Their experiences became part of the final chapter. Their voices helped explain why the case mattered beyond its notoriety. The investigation was not simply a contest between police and an elusive criminal. It was a long search for answers on behalf of people who had been forced to live without them. That is why the case refused to die. Detectives could have closed their files after years of failure. They could have accepted that the offender would never be identified. Instead, the evidence remained active. New investigators inherited old cases. New forensic techniques created new possibilities, and the people who had never forgotten kept the story alive. The Golden State Killer case became proof that persistence can outlast the limitations of a particular era. The detectives of 1976 could not have predicted the tools of 2018, but they preserved evidence that those future tools could use. That may be the most important lesson hidden inside the entire investigation. A cold case is not necessarily an empty case. It may contain evidence that nobody has yet learned how to interpret. It may contain clues that only become meaningful after technology changes. It may contain a biological signature that survives long after the person who left it believes the danger has passed. In the Golden State Killer investigation, the evidence waited for decades. Then the right method arrived. The family tree opened, the suspect emerged, the DNA confirmed the connection, and the man who had once seemed beyond identification was finally brought into the justice system. The case that refused to die had finally reached its answer. But the legacy of that answer was only beginning, because once investigators proved that genetic genealogy could reach backward across 4 decades and identify an unknown offender, an entirely new question entered the world of criminal justice. How many other killers had been hiding behind time? How many old cases contained evidence that was still waiting to speak? And how many mysteries once considered impossible were actually only waiting for the science of the future to catch up with the evidence of the past? The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo had created a sensation because it seemed to accomplish something that for decades of conventional investigation had failed to do. But behind the dramatic headlines was a quieter revolution taking place inside forensic science. The Golden State Killer case had become proof that an investigation could cross the boundary between generations. Evidence collected when investigators relied on paper files and physical maps could suddenly be analyzed with technology born decades later. That realization changed the meaning of a cold case. It suggested that an unsolved investigation was not necessarily a dead investigation. Sometimes it was simply an investigation waiting for the right tool. But before genetic genealogy could become the celebrated breakthrough of the case, investigators had to understand exactly what they were looking at. The DNA profile associated with the unknown offender was already enormously valuable. It had helped establish connections among crimes committed in different California jurisdictions. Yet for years, it remained anonymous. The profile could say that biological evidence from separate crime scenes came from the same person, but it could not say what that person's name was. Traditional forensic databases were designed largely around known profiles. If the offender's DNA was not already in the system, investigators could search again and again and receive the same answer. No match. The evidence existed. The suspect did not. That was the fundamental obstacle. The Golden State Killer had effectively become a biological ghost. Investigators knew his genetic identity without knowing his personal identity. It was one of the strangest situations imaginable in criminal investigation. They knew something uniquely personal about the offender, yet they could not connect that information to a human being. The passage of time made the problem even harder. Every year that passed increased the distance between the crime scenes and the investigators. People moved. Records changed. Witnesses aged. Detectives retired. Some died. The original officers who had stood at the first crime scenes were gradually replaced by a new generation who had not been there when the investigation began. But the DNA remained. And eventually, researchers began asking whether DNA could be used in a completely different way. Instead of searching for the offender directly, could investigators search for his relative? That was the question that opened the door to genetic genealogy. The principle was straightforward but powerful. Relatives share portions of their DNA because they inherit genetic material from common ancestors. A person does not have to submit their own DNA to a database for investigators to find a connection. A distant relative might provide enough information to point toward a family. From there, genealogical research could potentially reconstruct branches of a family tree until investigators found a person who fit the circumstances of the case. It was not a shortcut around evidence. It was a new way of generating leads from evidence that already existed. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most famous demonstrations of that concept. Investigators used the unknown DNA profile and searched for potential familial connections through genealogy data. The results did not immediately produce a photograph of the suspect. Instead, they produced relationships. Those relationships became clues. The investigators had to determine how those genetic connections could fit together and which family lines might eventually lead toward the unknown offender. That process required patience and careful analysis. A family tree can contain hundreds or thousands of individuals. Not every genetic match points directly toward the suspect. Some connections may be distant. Others may involve people who live in different states or countries. Investigators, therefore, had to combine genetic information with traditional investigative work. They looked at ages. They considered geography. They examined family history. They considered whether individuals could have been present in California during the relevant period. They eliminated people who did not fit. Slowly, the enormous search narrowed. Eventually, investigators identified Joseph D'Angelo as a person whose background warranted direct investigation. His age fit. His connection to California fit. His history required scrutiny. Most importantly, investigators could now test whether the biological evidence associated with the unknown offender was connected to him. That direct test became decisive. According to investigators, discarded genetic material obtained from D'Angelo was compared with the crime scene profile. The result confirmed the connection that investigators had been seeking for decades. The suspect was no longer a theoretical possibility. He was the man whose DNA matched the evidence. The arrest followed on April 24, 2018. But even after the arrest, the importance of genetic genealogy continued to grow. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began studying the method. Cold case investigators realized that thousands of unsolved cases might contain biological evidence that had never been connected to a known offender. In the past, those cases might have remained permanently unresolved. Now, investigators had another possible route. A crime scene could contain DNA without a traditional database match. That did not necessarily mean the case was hopeless. The DNA might still contain information capable of identifying relatives. The relative might lead to a family. The family might lead to a suspect. And the suspect could then be investigated using traditional evidence. The Golden State Killer case had demonstrated the concept on an extraordinary scale, but its influence extended beyond one offender. It changed public expectations about cold cases. Suddenly, people who had spent decades believing that an old crime would never be solved could imagine another possibility. Maybe the evidence had simply been waiting. Maybe a technology not yet invented would eventually unlock it. Maybe a detective working in the future would look at the same evidence and see something that investigators of the past could not. That hope became one of the most important consequences of the D'Angelo investigation. But the technology also generated controversy. Genetic genealogy raised difficult questions about privacy because the people whose genetic information helped investigators were not necessarily suspect. A person could participate in genealogy research to learn about ancestry and family history, never imagining that the information could eventually contribute to a criminal investigation. Yet DNA is different from many other forms of personal information. It contains connections to relatives. One person's genetic information can reveal information about another person. That created a complicated ethical problem. If a distant relative's genetic data helps identify a suspected murderer, who owns the consequences of that connection? How should databases regulate law enforcement access? What standards should investigators follow? How much evidence should be required before a genealogy lead becomes an investigative target? These questions became central to discussions surrounding the Golden State Killer case. The science had demonstrated extraordinary power, but extraordinary power requires rules. Investigators had to distinguish between generating a lead and proving guilt. A genetic genealogy match was not itself a conviction. It was a path toward a suspect. Traditional investigation still mattered. Direct DNA comparison still mattered. Corroborating evidence still mattered. The Golden State Killer case worked because investigators did not simply find a family connection and declare the mystery solved. They used genealogy to narrow the search and then sought direct evidence linking D'Angelo to the crime scene profile. That distinction became important as other agencies began adopting similar techniques. The lesson was not that genealogy could magically solve any case. The lesson was that it could create investigative opportunities where traditional databases had reached a dead end. The story also revealed something profound about the nature of forensic evidence. Evidence does not have an expiration date simply because the public loses interest. A piece of biological material collected in 1976 can become more valuable in 2018 than it was when it was first collected. That sounds almost paradoxical, but it is exactly what happened. The value of the evidence changed because the technology changed. The biological material itself did not become smarter. Scientists became better at interpreting it. That is why preserving evidence is so important in cold cases. Investigators working decades ago cannot always know which technology will exist decades later. They can only preserve what they have as carefully as possible. The Golden State Killer investigation showed the enormous payoff of that principle. The evidence survived long enough to meet the science capable of interpreting it. The case also demonstrated the power of investigative persistence. It would be easy to look at the arrest and imagine a single brilliant breakthrough. In reality, the breakthrough rested on layers of work accumulated across generations. Detectives connected crimes. Laboratories developed DNA profiles. Investigators preserved evidence. Analysts revisited old cases. Genealogists reconstructed relationships. Detectives verified the suspect. Scientists performed direct comparisons. Prosecutors built the case. Each step depended on the one before it. Remove one piece and the final result might never have happened. That is why the Golden State Killer case cannot be reduced to one technology. Genetic genealogy was the key that opened the final door, but decades of traditional police work had built the hallway leading to it. The case became a bridge between old-fashioned investigation and modern forensic science. It showed that neither approach was sufficient by itself. The old evidence needed the new technology. The new technology needed the old evidence. Together, they solved a mystery that had survived more than 40 years. And while the public focused on the astonishing speed with which investigators moved after identifying D'Angelo, the deeper story was about how long the evidence had been waiting. For years, the DNA profile had been an anonymous signature. For years, investigators had known that somewhere in the world was a man whose biological evidence was connected to multiple crimes. They simply did not know his name. Then genealogy provided the missing connection. A family tree became a map. The map became a list. The list became one suspect, and the suspect became Joseph D'Angelo. That transformation changed the case forever. The Golden State Killer had spent decades protected by anonymity. His greatest defense had not been a hidden fortress or an elaborate escape plan. It had been the simple fact that investigators did not know who he was. Once that anonymity disappeared, the investigation accelerated. The evidence was no longer pointing towards an invisible figure. It was pointing toward a living man, and that man could no longer disappear behind a sketch, an alias, or the passage of time. The cold case had become a current case. The past had entered the present, and for the survivors who had waited through decades of uncertainty, the most important change was not technological at all. It was personal. The question that had haunted them for years finally had an answer. Someone had been responsible. Someone had a name. Someone would face the justice system. The mystery was ending, but the consequences of the truth were only beginning. When Joseph James D'Angelo appeared in court, the Golden State Killer was no longer an invisible figure hiding behind decades of uncertainty. He was a defendant. His name was on the record. His photograph was known. His identity had been established through evidence that had survived for more than 40 years. But the courtroom could not simply rely on the extraordinary story of how investigators found him. It had to deal with the crimes themselves, the evidence connected to each charge, and the people whose lives had been altered by what happened decades earlier. The legal process therefore became a second investigation, one that looked backward through time while moving forward toward a final judgment. For prosecutors, the central challenge was to transform a sprawling history of unsolved crimes into a case that could be presented in court. The Golden State Killer investigation had involved numerous jurisdictions and multiple names. The East Area Rapist had terrorized communities in Northern California. The original Night Stalker had been associated with murders farther south. Investigators eventually established that these identities belonged to the same offender, but a courtroom required precision. Each charge needed evidence. Each connection needed to withstand scrutiny. Each allegation had to be tied to the defendant. That process demanded an extraordinary review of the old evidence. Investigators returned to files that had been created before many modern forensic techniques existed. They examined laboratory records, crime scene evidence, investigative reports, witness accounts, and other material accumulated over decades. The passage of time made the task difficult, but it also made the evidence more significant. The old files represented a record of what investigators knew at each stage of the original investigation. They showed how the case had developed, how different crimes had been connected, and how the offender's identity had remained unknown despite years of effort. Now, with D'Angelo identified, investigators could examine those files from an entirely different perspective. Details that had once belonged to an unknown suspect could now be compared against the known history of one man, his employment, his residences, his movements, his connections to California community. The goal was not to force old evidence to fit a new suspect. The goal was to determine whether the evidence naturally connected to him. The DNA provided the critical scientific foundation, but the prosecution's case was broader than one laboratory result. The investigation had to demonstrate that the same man connected to the DNA profile was also responsible for the specific crimes charged. That distinction mattered because criminal convictions require proof beyond reasonable doubt. The genealogy process had helped investigators find D'Angelo. The direct DNA comparison helped connect him to biological evidence. The broader case connected that evidence to particular crimes. It was a chain, and every link mattered. As the legal proceedings continued, the public began hearing details that had been buried in police files for decades. The story of the Golden State Killer became more than a historical mystery. It became a human story about people who had waited almost an entire lifetime for answers. The survivors were no longer simply unnamed figures in police reports. Their experiences became part of the public record. Their voices were heard during proceedings. Their statements revealed the long shadow created by crimes that had occurred when many of them were young. The impact had not ended when the offender left. Fear could continue long after the immediate danger disappeared. Memories could remain vivid. Ordinary sounds, places, or routines could become reminders of something that had happened decades earlier. That was one reason the sentencing proceedings became so significant. The legal system could not undo the past, but it could provide a public acknowledgement that what happened had happened, that the victims were believed, and that the person responsible had finally been identified and held accountable. The defendant's own decision to plead guilty changed the nature of that process. Instead of forcing survivors through a lengthy trial, the plea agreement allowed prosecutors to obtain convictions and life sentences without parole while avoiding the uncertainty of a full trial. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea was a remarkable development in a case that had spent decades without a clear resolution. The man whose identity had once been unknown was now formally accepting responsibility for a significant portion of the crimes associated with the Golden State Killer. The admissions also helped establish a legal record that would survive long after the investigation itself ended. The case would no longer exist only in police files or memories. It would exist in court documents, convictions, and sentencing records. That mattered for families who had spent years wondering whether the truth would ever be established. But the guilty plea did not mean that every question surrounding the Golden State Killer disappeared. There were still crimes that could not be prosecuted, crimes affected by legal limitations, unavailable evidence, or circumstances that made prosecution impossible. The known history of the offender was larger than the charges to which he pleaded guilty. Investigators had long associated him with a much broader pattern of attacks, and the case remained one of the most extensive investigations in California criminal history. Yet the legal system could only act on what prosecutors could charge and prove. That limitation is one of the realities of cold cases. Time can create enormous gaps. Witnesses may disappear. Evidence may be lost. Laws may change. Some crimes may fall outside statutes of limitation. A historical investigation can therefore reveal more than the courtroom can formally resolve. The distinction between what investigators believe and what a court can legally establish is essential. In the Golden State Killer case, however, the evidence was strong enough to produce multiple murder convictions and life sentences. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The sentence represented the final legal consequence of an investigation that had begun more than 4 decades earlier. The courtroom had finally closed the distance between the crimes of the past and the defendant of the present. Yet the emotional atmosphere surrounding sentencing was unlike an ordinary criminal proceeding. This was not simply a case that had lasted months or a few years. It had lasted generations. Some of the people connected to the case had been waiting since the 1970s. The survivors who spoke had lived through decades without knowing the identity of the offender. Families had spent years carrying questions that could not be answered. The sentence, therefore, represented more than punishment. It represented recognition. The justice system was formally acknowledging the crimes and the suffering they had caused. The defendant would not return to the community. He would spend the remainder of his life in prison, but no sentence could restore what had been taken from the victims and their families. That contradiction remained at the center of the case. Justice had finally arrived, but justice could not reverse time. It could not erase fear. It could not restore a murdered family member. It could not return the years spent wondering whether the killer would ever be found. It could only establish accountability, and accountability mattered because the alternative was uncertainty. For decades, the unknown identity of the Golden State Killer had allowed the case to remain psychologically unfinished. The victims knew what had happened to them, but the world did not know who had done it. The families of murder victims knew whom they had lost, but the person responsible remained unidentified. The investigation had evidence but no name. The arrest changed that. Suddenly, the mystery had a human face. That face belonged to Joseph D'Angelo. The revelation created another unsettling realization. He had not been living in some remote place beyond the reach of society. He had been living in California. He had grown old. He had experienced decades of ordinary life while the crimes remained unsolved. That fact became one of the most disturbing elements of the case because it demonstrated how dramatically time can separate a person from the public image created by their alleged crime. The Golden State Killer was remembered through old sketches and descriptions. Joseph D'Angelo appeared as an elderly man. The two images seemed almost impossible to reconcile, yet DNA connected them. Science bridged the decades. The biological evidence did not care that the suspect's appearance had changed. It did not care that the investigation had become famous. It did not care that the crimes had occurred 40 years earlier. It identified a biological connection that remained consistent. That was the power of forensic evidence. It could survive the passage of time in ways that human memory could not. The case also demonstrated why investigators continue preserving evidence even when a case appears hopeless. In the 1970s, nobody could have predicted exactly how genetic genealogy would develop. Nobody knew that consumer ancestry databases would become widespread. Nobody knew that investigators would eventually be able to use distant familial relationships to generate leads in cold cases. Yet the evidence was preserved. Decades later, that evidence became the foundation of the breakthrough. The lesson was simple but profound. A cold case is not necessarily a case without answers. It may be a case whose answer has not yet become accessible. Technology changes the meaning of evidence. A clue that seems weak in one decade may become decisive in another. A biological sample that cannot identify anyone today may become a direct path to a suspect tomorrow. That is exactly what happened here. The Golden State Killer case became a symbol of what can happen when persistence meets technological change. But the story also became a warning. Criminals may believe that time protects them. It can for a while, but time can also work against them. Every technological advancement creates new ways to examine old evidence. Every new database creates new connections. Every new scientific method can expose information that investigators previously could not access. The killer's greatest advantage was once his anonymity. Genetic genealogy destroyed that advantage. Once investigators had a family connection, the mystery became a narrowing search. Once they had a suspect, DNA provided the direct link. Once the evidence was confirmed, the legal process could begin. And once D'Angelo pleaded guilty, the 40-year investigation finally reached its legal conclusion. But the broader impact of the case was only starting to become clear. Across the country, families with unsolved cases began asking the same question. Could their case be next? Could old DNA evidence reveal a relative of the offender? Could a family tree expose a killer who had escaped identification for decades? The Golden State Killer had shown that the answer could be yes, and that possibility changed the future of cold case investigations forever. The Golden State Killer case had reached a courtroom, but its influence was already moving far beyond California. Investigators around the country were watching what had happened because the breakthrough challenged one of the oldest assumptions in criminal investigation: that a case becomes less solvable simply because it becomes old. For decades, the Golden State Killer investigation had seemed to confirm that assumption. The offender had vanished. Conventional databases had failed to identify him. Witness memories had inevitably aged. Detectives had retired, yet the evidence remained. And once genetic genealogy gave investigators a way to interpret that evidence differently, the passage of time suddenly looked less like an obstacle and more like a resource. 40 years had allowed the technology to evolve. It had allowed genealogy databases to expand. It had allowed scientists to refine the methods used to interpret genetic information. The killer had been protected by the limitations of the past, but he was eventually exposed by the technology of the future. That realization created enormous hope among families whose cases had remained unsolved for decades. Across the United States, police agencies began reconsidering old evidence. Cases that had once been placed in storage were being reviewed. Biological evidence was being examined again. Investigators began asking whether old DNA profiles could be used with genealogy techniques. The Golden State Killer had become a blueprint for a new investigative strategy. But the strategy was not as simple as television headlines sometimes suggested. Genetic genealogy was not a magic button. It did not instantly produce a suspect's name. It created leads by revealing genetic relationships, and those relationships had to be interpreted carefully. Investigators still needed traditional police work. They needed to reconstruct family trees, examine historical records, establish geographic connections, and eliminate people who did not fit. Then they needed direct evidence connecting the final suspect to the crime. The Golden State Killer case worked because these methods were combined rather than treated as substitutes for one another. The genealogy pointed investigators toward Joseph D'Angelo. The direct DNA evidence helped establish the connection. The criminal investigation then built the case around that evidence and the historical record. The process was a reminder that modern technology does not eliminate old-fashioned detective work. It changes where the detective begins. For decades, investigators had started with a crime and tried to move outward toward a suspect. Genetic genealogy allowed them to start with biological relationships and work inward toward an individual. The direction had changed. The evidence had not. That shift was revolutionary. It meant that a suspect did not necessarily need to have a criminal record, a known connection to the police, or a previous DNA profile in a law enforcement database. A distant relative could potentially provide the first clue. The implication was enormous. A person who had never been arrested could still become identifiable through their family tree. A criminal who believed he had never left his DNA in a database could still be connected to a genealogy profile through relative. The Golden State Killer had apparently benefited for decades from exactly that kind of anonymity. His own DNA was not producing a conventional database match, but the genetic information still contained a map of his biological relationships. Investigators simply had to learn how to read it. That scientific breakthrough also transformed the public understanding of DNA. For years, many people thought of DNA primarily as a forensic fingerprint. Either it matched or it did not. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated that DNA could also reveal relationships. It could point sideways through a family rather than directly toward an individual. A cousin could become a clue. A distant relative could become a starting point. A family tree could become an investigative tool. The idea was both fascinating and unsettling. Fascinating because it could solve crimes that had resisted every conventional method. Unsettling because it meant genetic information could have consequences far beyond the individual who provided it. That issue became one of the most controversial parts of the case's legacy. People who had submitted DNA to genealogy services had done so for many reasons. Some wanted to learn about their ancestry. Some wanted to find biological relatives. Some wanted to understand where their families came from. Few were thinking about criminal investigation. Yet the genetic connections contained in those databases could potentially help identify someone else. That created a new legal and ethical landscape. How should investigators use genealogy databases? What types of crimes should qualify? What level of suspicion should be required? How should innocent relatives be protected? And who should decide the rules? These questions became increasingly important as more agencies began exploring genetic genealogy. The Golden State Killer case had demonstrated the extraordinary power of the technique, but it had also demonstrated why boundaries matter. A scientific tool that can reveal family relationships is fundamentally different from a fingerprint search. A fingerprint belongs to one person. Genetic information connects generations. It contains information about people who may never have chosen to participate. That complexity ensured that the Golden State Killer investigation would remain part of public debate long after D'Angelo was sentenced. But for many families, the debate was secondary to the possibility of resolution. For them, the most important lesson was that time might no longer be an absolute barrier. A case from the 1970s could potentially be solved in the 21st century. Evidence collected before the internet could become decisive in an investigation conducted through modern databases. A suspect who had escaped identification for decades could suddenly become vulnerable to a scientific method that had not existed when the crime occurred. That possibility changed the emotional landscape surrounding cold cases. Instead of thinking only about what investigators had failed to discover, families could begin thinking about what future investigators might still discover. Hope became part of the investigation, but hope had to be balanced with realism. Not every case contains usable DNA. Not every DNA profile is suitable for genealogy. Not every genetic connection leads to a suspect. Some cases lack sufficient evidence. Others involve biological material that has degraded over time. Some investigations have no surviving physical evidence at all. Genetic genealogy is therefore powerful but not universal. The Golden State Killer case was extraordinary partly because investigators had biological evidence that remained usable and a complex family network that could eventually be reconstructed. The method worked because the necessary pieces were present. That distinction became important as families and investigators looked toward other cold cases. Still, the psychological impact of the case could not be underestimated. For decades, the Golden State Killer had been a symbol of uncertainty. His crimes had become part of California's history. His aliases had become familiar. His sketches had circulated for years. The investigation had seemed almost legendary because the offender had remained unidentified for so long. Then the arrest destroyed the mythology. The killer was not a supernatural figure. He was not an invisible ghost. He was a human being who had left behind biological evidence. The mystery had been sustained by the absence of a name. Once the name was known, the story became much more concrete. The arrest also demonstrated the importance of public information. The FBI had launched a national campaign in 2016 seeking information about the East Area rapist and Golden State Killer and offering a reward. That campaign showed that law enforcement had not abandoned the investigation. Even after decades, authorities were still asking the public for help. The case remained active because investigators understood that one new piece of information could potentially change everything. In the end, the breakthrough came through genetics rather than a traditional tip, but the campaign reflected the persistence that had kept the case alive. The investigation had survived because law enforcement agencies refused to treat the passage of time as proof that the answer did not exist. That persistence became part of the case's mythology. It was not simply the story of a criminal who escaped for 40 years. It was also the story of investigators who refused to stop searching. The case had passed from one generation of detectives to another. Each generation inherited the same unanswered question. Each generation brought different skills. Some detectives understood the original crime scenes. Others understood modern forensic science. Others understood genealogy. The final breakthrough depended on all of them. The investigators who first collected evidence could never have predicted the technology that would eventually identify D'Angelo. But without their work, the later investigators would have had nothing to use. This is the hidden architecture of cold case investigations. Success may appear sudden, but it is often built from decades of invisible labor. A detective records a detail. A laboratory preserves a sample. Another investigator reviews a report years later. A scientist develops a new method. A genealogist finds a connection. A detective follows the lead. A laboratory confirms the DNA. The final moment appears dramatic because it happens quickly. But the path to that moment can take generations. The Golden State Killer case is perhaps one of the clearest examples of that principle. The arrest happened in 2018. The guilty plea came in 2020, but the evidence that made those events possible had been gathered decades earlier. The investigation was never truly beginning again. It was continuing from where previous investigators had been forced to stop. That idea carries an important message for every unresolved investigation. A case may be inactive without being finished. Evidence may be dormant without being useless. A file may sit untouched for years while the world outside it changes. Then one technological breakthrough can reopen the entire story. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that the future can solve the past. It showed that science can reach across decades and connect people who never expected to be connected. And it showed that anonymity is not always permanent. Joseph D'Angelo had remained unidentified for more than 40 years. His name was finally discovered through a path that nobody could have followed when the first crimes occurred. The same passage of time that once seemed to protect him ultimately helped create the tools that exposed him. That paradox became the enduring lesson of the case. Time does not always bury the truth. Sometimes it preserves the evidence long enough for the truth to be found. And once that realization entered the world of criminal investigation, the Golden State Killer stopped being merely a solved case. He became a symbol of what might still be possible. Somewhere, perhaps, another old file was waiting, another biological profile, another unidentified suspect, another family wondering whether an answer would ever come. The Golden State Killer had shown that 40 years did not necessarily mean too late. The clock could keep running, the evidence could keep waiting, and somewhere in the future, another investigation might discover the technology capable of finally making the past speak. The story of the Golden State Killer had begun with fear, but its final chapters became a story about evidence, endurance, and the strange way time can transform an unsolved crime. For decades, investigators had worked with information that seemed insufficient to identify the offender. They knew the crimes were connected. They knew a biological profile existed. They knew the offender had operated across California. Yet the name remained beyond reach. Then modern genetic genealogy changed the equation, and Joseph D'Angelo was identified. But even after that extraordinary breakthrough, the case continued to raise questions about what justice means when it arrives 40 years after the crime. For the people who survived the attacks and for the families of those who were killed, justice could not simply be measured by an arrest. The arrest was a beginning. It was the moment uncertainty was replaced by identity. But identity brought its own consequences. Suddenly, people who had spent decades imagining an unknown offender knew exactly who investigators believed had been responsible. The man was no longer a shadow. He was a person who had lived a recognizable life, had worked as a police officer, had raised a family, and had grown old while the investigation remained unresolved. That contrast was difficult to process. How could someone associated with crimes that had generated such fear have spent so many years moving through ordinary society? The answer was not simple, and the case offered no easy explanation for the distance between public perception and private life. What investigators could establish was that the evidence had finally connected D'Angelo to the crime scene DNA. That scientific link was the foundation of the prosecution. It was not based on a resemblance. It was not based on a rumor. It was not based on a decades-old suspicion. It was based on biological evidence preserved from the crimes and compared with DNA obtained from D'Angelo. The direct comparison provided the confirmation that transformed the genealogy investigation from an investigative led into a powerful evidentiary connection. That distinction became one of the most important facts in understanding the arrest. Genetic genealogy helped investigators find the road. DNA helped confirm that they had reached the right destination. The legal process then had to determine what crimes could be prosecuted and what evidence could be presented. Prosecutors ultimately charged D'Angelo with multiple murders and other offenses. The case became one of the largest and most closely watched criminal proceedings involving a cold case in modern American history. Yet the sheer age of the investigation created unusual circumstances. More than 40 years had passed since the first attack. The California communities involved had changed. Some witnesses had moved away. Some investigators had retired. Some people connected to the original cases had died. The passage of time meant that a traditional trial could have become an enormous reconstruction of history. Prosecutors would have had to present evidence from multiple decades. Survivors would have had to revisit traumatic memories. Families would have had to listen to details of crimes that had remained painful for generations. The legal system therefore faced a difficult choice between pursuing a full trial and seeking a resolution that would provide certainty without forcing survivors through years of additional litigation. The guilty plea eventually became that resolution. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement ensured that he would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the families of the victims, the guilty plea provided a definitive answer. The man standing before the court accepted responsibility for the crimes covered by the agreement. There would be no question about whether a jury might acquit him. There would be no prolonged trial in which the evidence was repeatedly challenged in public. The case could move towards sentencing. But the plea also created a strange emotional moment. The Golden State Killer had spent decades refusing to give the public a name. Now, after 40 years, the name was known. The mystery had become history. Yet history was painful. The people who spoke at sentencing carried memories that stretched back to another era. Some had lived most of their lives with the knowledge that the person who had harmed them had never been identified. Others had spent decades wondering whether the killer was still alive. The arrest changed those questions into certainty. He had been alive. He had been identified. He had been arrested, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The sentence followed in August 2020. D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The legal consequences were final, but the emotional consequences could not be measured in years. A sentence can specify how long a person will remain imprisoned. It cannot specify when a survivor will stop remembering. It cannot determine when a family will stop feeling the absence of someone who was killed. It cannot return the years that passed while the case remained unresolved. That is one of the hardest truths in any cold case. Solving a crime does not undo it. Justice arrives in the present, but the damage occurred in the past. The two moments can never be made identical. The Golden State Killer case made that contradiction particularly visible because so much time had passed. More than 4 decades separated the crimes from the arrest. The people who had been young adults in the 1970s were now older. The detectives who had once been young officers were retired or gone. The communities that had once been terrified had changed beyond recognition, yet the memories remained. The case had become part of California's collective history. It was remembered not only because of the crimes, but because of the mystery. The idea that one offender could evade identification for decades fascinated the public. The old sketches became iconic. The names East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker became associated with an unanswered question. The case appeared almost impossible to solve. Then genetic genealogy shattered that assumption. It proved that the mystery had not been impossible. It had simply required a method that did not exist when the crimes occurred. That lesson transformed the way investigators approached old evidence. Instead of seeing an old biological profile as a dead end, they could see it as a potential family map. Instead of asking whether the suspect's own DNA was in a database, they could ask whether a relative's DNA might be present somewhere in genealogical records. Instead of waiting for a traditional match, investigators could build a family tree. The approach required careful work and raised ethical questions, but its potential was undeniable. The Golden State Killer investigation had shown that the boundaries of forensic science were changing. A criminal could be identified through relationships rather than through a direct database match. That possibility was especially powerful for offenders who had never been arrested or whose DNA was not already stored in law enforcement systems. The technique could potentially reach across generations. A person who had committed a crime decades earlier might leave no direct digital trace, but their relatives could create one unknowingly. The concept was both scientifically fascinating and socially complicated. It meant that the biological identity of one person could become visible through the genetic information of another. The case therefore became part of a broader national debate about privacy and law enforcement. But while scientists and policymakers discussed the future, survivors and families remained focused on the past. Their experience was much more immediate. They had waited. They had remembered. They had lived with uncertainty. The arrest finally gave them something the investigation had been unable to provide for most of their lives, an answer. The answer did not need to be dramatic. It did not need to be cinematic. It only needed to be true. Joseph D'Angelo was the man identified through the evidence. The man who had been known by multiple aliases now had one legal identity. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown offender. He was a convicted murderer serving multiple life sentences. That transformation represented the end of one of the most extraordinary cold case investigations in American history. But the story continued to influence investigators because the method that solved it could potentially be applied elsewhere. Families across the country began wondering whether their own unsolved cases might contain the same kind of hidden opportunity. Could a sample collected decades ago still produce a genetic profile? Could a distant relative provide a lead? Could an investigator rebuild a family tree and finally put a name to an unknown offender? There were no guarantees, but the Golden State Killer case had changed the question from, is this case too old? To what evidence survived and what can modern science do with it? That was a profound shift. The age of a case was no longer the only measure of its potential. The quality of the evidence mattered. The preservation of biological material mattered. The availability of modern databases mattered. The persistence of investigators mattered. And, above all, the willingness to reopen old questions mattered. The Golden State Killer had once seemed protected by time. In the end, time became part of the mechanism that exposed him. The same decades that separated him from the original investigation also created the technology that could reach him. His appearance changed. His circumstances changed. His life moved forward. But the DNA remained a constant. That biological signature became the thread connecting the past to the present. Investigators followed it through genealogy until they reached his name. They then confirmed the connection through direct DNA evidence. The arrest followed. The guilty plea followed. The sentence followed. And after 40 years, the case finally entered history not as an unsolved mystery, but as a solved one. Yet the most haunting question was not about the past. It was about the future. How many other cases were still waiting for their own genetic connection? How many unknown offenders had left behind biological evidence without realizing its significance? How many families were still staring at old photographs, old police sketches, and old newspaper articles, wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified? The Golden State Killer case could not answer those questions, but it offered something almost as important. It offered proof that a case can survive longer than the technology available to solve it. It proved that evidence collected in one generation can become decisive in another, and it reminded investigators that a cold case should never be judged solely by its age. Somewhere inside an old file, there may still be a clue waiting for the future. Somewhere inside preserved evidence, there may be a biological signature that has never stopped telling the truth. And somewhere, perhaps, another name is already hidden inside a family tree, waiting for investigators to find the branch that leads to it. By the time Joseph James D'Angelo stood before the court in 2020, the Golden State Killer investigation had traveled farther through time than almost anyone involved could have imagined when the first attacks began in 1970. The case had survived changing police departments, changing technology, changing communities, and generations of investigators. It had survived the disappearance of the original suspect's face from public memory and the gradual transformation of a terrifying criminal investigation into one of America's most notorious cold cases. But now the uncertainty was gone. The evidence had led investigators to D'Angelo, the DNA had connected him to the crimes, and the legal system was preparing to impose its final judgment. Yet the courtroom was not simply the end of an investigation. It became a place where decades of fear, unanswered questions, and grief collided with the present. For the people connected to the case, the defendant sitting in front of them represented something that had once seemed impossible. The anonymous offender finally had a face. The aliases that had dominated newspapers for decades were no longer the only way to describe him. East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, Golden State Killer. Those names had described a mystery. Joseph James D'Angelo described a person, and that difference mattered. For decades, Investigators had been forced to talk about an unknown man. They had relied on descriptions, sketches, behavioral patterns, and biological evidence. Now they could speak about a specific individual whose identity had been established through modern forensic investigation. The transformation was extraordinary because the passage of time had made the suspect almost unrecognizable compared with the young man described by early witnesses. He was no longer the figure in old police sketches. He was an elderly defendant. But the DNA evidence provided continuity where appearance could not. It linked the present to the past. It connected the man in the courtroom to biological evidence preserved from crimes that had occurred decades earlier. The courtroom, therefore, became the final stage of a journey that began long before genetic genealogy existed. The investigators who first collected evidence could not have imagined that their work would eventually be combined with family tree research and modern genetic analysis. Yet that is exactly what happened. The case became a demonstration of how investigations can evolve without losing their original foundation. New technology did not erase the old evidence. It gave the old evidence new meaning. That principle was visible throughout the prosecution. Investigators revisited historical reports. They examined old evidence. They compared the known facts about D'Angelo with the details preserved from the original investigations. The goal was to establish a coherent connection between the defendant and the crime. The evidence had to survive the passage of time not only scientifically, but legally. A sample collected 40 years earlier had to be explained. A report written by a detective who might have retired decades ago had to be understood. A witness statement had to be interpreted in the context of what was known at the time. The case required investigators to bridge two different eras of law enforcement. That was one of the reasons the Golden State Killer investigation became such a landmark. It showed that the passage of time does not necessarily destroy an investigation if evidence is preserved and later investigators are willing to reconstruct the past carefully. The guilty plea in June 2020 accelerated the process. D'Angelo admitted responsibility for 13 murders and 13 kidnapping-related charges. The plea agreement allowed prosecutors to secure life imprisonment without parole while avoiding a lengthy trial. For survivors, the decision meant that they would not necessarily have to endure years of courtroom proceedings. For families, it meant that the person responsible for the charged crimes would be formally convicted. The plea also created a powerful moment of historical significance. For decades, the Golden State Killer had refused to provide the one thing investigators needed most, an identity. Now the defendant's own admission stood beside the DNA evidence and the investigative record. The mystery that had once seemed almost impossible had become a matter of legal fact. But the emotional weight of the proceedings came from the people who had spent decades waiting for that fact. Victims and relatives were given opportunities to speak. Their statements brought the case out of the language of statistics and back into the language of human experience. It is easy for a case of this size to become a collection of numbers. 45 sexual assaults, 12 murders, more than 120 burglaries, multiple jurisdictions, 40 years. These numbers help describe the scale of an investigation, but they cannot describe what those crimes meant to individual people. Each victim had a life before the crime. Each family had a future they expected to share. Each survivor had to continue living after the offender disappeared. The courtroom gave some of those people a chance to speak directly about the consequences. Their words demonstrated why solving a cold case is not merely an intellectual exercise. It is not simply a detective's puzzle. It is an attempt to resolve something that has remained unfinished in the lives of real people. For some survivors, the arrest meant they could finally stop wondering whether the offender might return. For families of murder victims, it meant knowing that the person responsible had been identified and sentenced. For investigators, it meant that decades of work had not been wasted. The sentence in August 2020 brought the legal proceedings to their conclusion. D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge's decision transformed the case from an active prosecution into a completed chapter of criminal history. But completion is not the same as erasure. The Golden State Killer case could be legally closed while remaining emotionally present for the people who lived through it. The memories did not disappear because the sentence had been announced. The neighborhoods where crimes occurred did not lose their history. families did not suddenly forget those who had been killed. Survivors did not simply wake up one morning without memories of the past. Closure, when it comes, is often complicated. It can contain relief and anger, certainty and grief, satisfaction and sadness. The arrest can answer the question of who did it without answering every question about why it happened. The guilty plea can establish responsibility without repairing every consequence. The sentence can remove the offender from society without restoring the years lost to fear. The Golden State Killer case made all of those contradictions visible. It also demonstrated the importance of naming the victims rather than allowing the offender to dominate the story. For years, the public fascination centered on the unknown killer. His aliases became famous. His sketches circulated. His ability to evade identification became the central mystery. But once the suspect was identified, the focus could shift toward the people whose lives had been changed. That shift mattered because cold cases can sometimes become famous for the wrong reason. The mystery becomes larger than the human beings affected by it. The Golden State Killer case was certainly an extraordinary investigative story, but it was also a story about people who had endured uncertainty for decades. The final legal proceedings helped restore some balance by giving survivors and families a public voice. Their experiences became part of the record. Their losses could not be reversed, but they could be acknowledged. And that acknowledgement became one of the most meaningful aspects of the case's conclusion. Outside the courtroom, the investigation was already creating another legacy. Law enforcement agencies began looking at genetic genealogy with renewed interest. Investigators realized that an unknown DNA profile might not remain unknown forever. The Golden State Killer had demonstrated that a family tree could become an investigative map. The method could potentially identify suspects who had never appeared in a conventional criminal database. It could also help identify unknown remains and potentially bring answers to families who had been waiting for decades. The possibilities were enormous, but so were the ethical questions. Genetic information is not ordinary evidence. It carries information about relatives and biological relationship. When a person participates in genealogy research, they may not realize that their genetic data could indirectly help identify someone else. That means investigators must consider not only whether a technique works, but how it should be used. The Golden State Killer case became a starting point for discussions about guidelines, privacy, and responsible investigative practice. The case had shown what science could accomplish. Society now had to decide how to manage that power. Still, the scientific lesson remained undeniable. DNA can survive the passage of time. A biological profile can remain useful even when the offender believes the past is unreachable. The killer's anonymity had depended on the limitations of traditional identification. Once investigators could search through genetic relationships, the anonymity began to collapse. A family tree became the unexpected weakness in a defense built on time. D'Angelo had no reason to expect that someone else related to him might provide the clue investigators needed. Yet that is precisely how the modern investigation approached the mystery. It did not need to find him directly. It needed to find a path to him. That path eventually led investigators through generations of biological relationships and into his own life. The result was one of the most dramatic cold case breakthroughs in American history. But perhaps the most important lesson was not about the technology itself. It was about persistence. The technology mattered because investigators continued searching for ways to use it. The DNA mattered because someone had preserved it. The old files mattered because someone had kept them. The case mattered because investigators refused to accept that its age meant its answer was gone. The Golden State Killer had survived 40 years because his identity remained unknown. He was finally caught because investigators discovered that identity could be reconstructed indirectly. The mystery had been approached from a completely different direction. And once the right direction was found, the case moved with extraordinary speed. A family connection, a suspect, a DNA comparison, an arrest, a prosecution, a guilty plea, a life sentence. For decades of uncertainty compressed into a sequence of events that unfolded in only a few years, yet the emotional distance between those events remained enormous. The first crimes belonged to another generation. The final sentence belonged to a world transformed by technology. Between those moments were thousands of days in which survivors waited, investigators searched, and evidence remained silent. That silence was never permanent. It was simply waiting for someone to understand how to hear it. The Golden State Killer case proved that the past can speak through evidence long after the people who created the original investigation are gone. It proved that a cold case can survive the limitations of its own era, and it left behind a question that continues to haunt investigators everywhere. If one 40-year-old mystery could be solved because a new scientific method finally revealed what old evidence had been hiding, how many other mysteries are still waiting for the same moment?